During the cramped ménage à trois, fit punishment for having flouted her father's advice. As her niece observed, Aunt Eliza loved her husband, and she liked poor Nancy, but Aunt Eliza's brothers came down and made William put Nancy away. In this period of Eliza's marriage, Mr. Davison is conspicuous by his absence, leaving one to wonder whether he had temporarily washed his hands of his disobedient daughter, or whether, cowed by guilt and embarrassment, she had hidden her troubles from him. By one account, when Nancy grew quarrelsome after Bill's marriage, he seized the chance to expel his shrewish mistress from the Pack household. Heeding the pleas from the Davisons, he posted Nancy and the two daughters to live with her parents in nearby Harvard Mills. Family legend claims that Bill, who had a weak but not entirely dormant conscience, secretly deposited clothing bundles on her doorstep. Fortunately, the years with Bill didn't like Nancy's life, for she married a man named Burlingame, bore other children, and furnished her first two daughters with a respectable upbringing. From the skimpy documentary evidence, we know that Clorinda died young, while Cornelia grew up into a tall, smart, attractive school teacher with a telling resemblance to Big Bill. Sometimes he acceded to her demands for money, but there were strict limits to Bill's generosity, and he would rebuff her when she became too clamorous. Cornelia married a man named Sexton and remained in the Richford area, but only a few local residents and Rockefeller relatives knew that she was John Dee's half-sister. To her credit, Cornelia never tried to cash in on her kinship with the world's richest man, perhaps because it would unavoidably have advertised her illegitimacy. It is impossible to determine whether Rockefeller ever knew of the existence of his two illegitimate half-sisters. The Nancy Brown affair wasn't the only indignity visited upon Eliza, for she was often abandoned by Bill during her 3 cheerless years in Richford. He remained a restless and defiant individualist who preferred life beyond the pale of society. Early in the marriage, she stayed put for a while, operating a small sawmill on Michigan Hill and dealing in salt, fur, horses, and timber. But he soon resumed the footloose life of a peddler, his trips cloaked in unfathomable mystery. Like a fugitive, he would depart furtively under cover of night and return after dark, weeks or months later, flinging pebbles at the window to signal his return. To tide over his family in his absence, he arranged for credit at the general store. "Give my family anything they want while I'm away," he instructed Chauncey Rich, whose father, Ezekiel, had founded Richford. "And when I come back, I'll settle." Never knowing when this credit might be canceled, Eliza became extremely frugal and drilled her children in thrifty maxims, such as, "Willful waste makes woeful want." When Bill returned home, a sudden smiling apparition, he would be riding new horses, wearing fine clothes, and brandishing a thick wad of crisp bills. Before going to see Eliza, he would pay off Chauncey Rich so that he could confidently tell her everything was now squared away at the store. His seductive charm melted away whatever hostility his absence had aroused. It took time before his extended absences and repeated betrayals burned the romance out of her system, leaving a residue of stoic resignation. For the moment, whatever her anxieties or loneliness, she seemed girlishly lovelorn during his trips, still smitten with her flim-flam man. "Just look at that moon," she once sighed to a cousin when Bill was on the road. "Is he miles and miles away, perhaps looking at it too at this moment? I do hope he is." On the road, Bill improvised ever more fanciful ways to make money. A crack shop. He made the circuit of shooting contests, often bringing home prize money. A glad-handing huckster, he sold rings and other knickknacks at fantastic markups. Mostly, though, he styled himself a botanic physician or herbal doctor, euphemisms faithfully parroted by some Rockefeller descendants. At a time when physicians still resorted to bleeding, blistering, and violent purgatives, and many rustic areas lacked access to medical care, such traveling salesmen filled a vacuum. Nevertheless, in William Avery Rockefeller, one clearly detects the blarney and easy conviviality of the mountebank. Sometimes he peddled bottles of home-brewed elixir or patent medicines bought from druggists. But he scored his greatest success with natural medicines called physic work. Though his mother had a sincere interest in herbal remedies, Bill would grossly distort or exaggerate their properties. For instance, he harvested small purplish berries from her garden that resembled small pills, and would hawk them to farmers' wives as a sovereign remedy for stomach troubles. His sales pitch went even further, for as a Richford neighbor reported many years later, he would warn them solemnly that they must not be given to a woman in a delicate condition, for they would surely cause abortion. Thereupon, he would sell his pills at a high price. They were perfectly harmless, and he broke no law in selling them. He had remarkable imagination. The midnight rambles and peculiar commerce of William Rockefeller mystified the Richford citizenry. He both fired and troubled the imagination, generating so much gossip and speculation that they christened him Devil Bill. Rumors raced periodically through town that he was a gambler, a horse thief, a desperado. Though he seemed to operate on the edge of the law, people were delighted by his bluff humor and tall tales, yet dismayed by his treatment of his family. When he finally succeeded as a peddler, he would dress up like a prince, and kept everyone wondering, said one town resident who participated in the guessing game about Bill's manifold sources of income. He laughed a great deal and enjoyed the speculation he caused. He was not a drinking man and treated his family well when he was home, but everyone knew that he neglected the family by leaving them to shift for themselves for long months at a time. He frustrated those neighbors who ached for his comeuppance. After one prolonged absence of several months, when Eliza's bill at Chauncey Rich's topped $1,000, the scuttlebutt said that Devil Bill had been arrested. Instead, like a country squire, he came trotting into town in a magnificent carriage, seated behind a team of splendid horses, diamonds glittering in his shirt front. At the general store, he made a point of settling the tab with large bills. After such trips, Bill gathered friends and family around the dinner table and, while wolfing down heaps of food, would regale them with picaresque tales of his adventures among the western settlers and Indians. Devil Bill had a knack for weaving his experiences into spellbinding narratives, making Eliza and the children vicarious partners in his travels. As the chief casualty of Bill's termination, Eliza received sympathy from her neighbors because she was being abused by her husband. Yet she remained loyal to him, declined many opportunities to denigrate him, and carried herself with considerable dignity. However overblown the present biographical claims about John D. Rockefeller's impoverished childhood have been, several people testified to the family's squalor in Richford. I do not remember ever to have seen more pitiably neglected children, one neighbor observed. Their clothing was old and tattered, and they looked dirty and hungry. It was a measure of Eliza's desperation that she sought relief in the home of her brother-in-law, Jacob Rockefeller, a bawdy, jolly, not infrequently besotted man. An awful tale about Jacob recounted how he won a $5 bet by saying something to the entire town. Jacob's kindly wife became a second mother to the two toddlers, Lucy and John, darning their clothes and knitting them from woolen homespun. In this nightmarish situation, Eliza seemed to draw strength from adversity. One Richford native praised her as a most excellent woman, but one who bore too heavy a burden at that time properly to look after her children. Her husband was away for long periods, and she had to look after their farm of 60 acres and try to make it pay their expenses. She did not know at what time the shopkeepers of the village might shut down on her credit, and she worked very hard. When John D. later evoked his idyllic sunlit boyhood in upstate New York, he blotted out Richford from those reveries. Just 3 when he left there, he retained only a few hazy memories of the place. I remember very clearly the brook that ran near the front of the house and how careful I had to be to keep far away from it. I remember my mother vaguely at Richford and my grandmother, who lived half a mile or so up the hill. One notes that Rockefeller's earliest memory was associated with caution, and that he edited out the absentee father and inebriated grandfather while retaining the strong, enduring mother and grandmother. He always possessed an unusual self-protective capacity to suppress unpleasant memories and keep alive those things that fortified his resolve. As best we can tell, Rockefeller knew nothing of Nancy Brown and the seamy side of Richford existence, yet he carried through life a vague sense of an infernal place. I shudder to think of what I should have been if I had remained in Richford all my life, he later confided. There were many men who hunt a little, fish a little, and drink whiskey a little, and only attain a little success in life, and all for the lack of a little religion. Of his family's decision to leave Richford, Rockefeller offered an economic explanation that probably served as the standard cover story of his childhood: stingy soil. The country there is beautiful, Rockefeller would say, but the settlers wasted their energy in trying to get the stumps out of the ground and trying to make crops grow in a poor soil. The true reason, of course, was Eliza's horror of the town's low moral tone, as reflected by its single church. She was probably also eager to remove the children from the influence of her boisterous, drunken Rockefeller in-laws and expose them to the steadier Davisons. By no coincidence, the Rockefellers moved to Moravia, 3 miles from the Davison farm, where Eliza could enjoy her father's presence during her husband's habitual absences. Tears Settlement. Chapter 2. Fires of Revival. When the Rockefellers moved 30 miles north from Richford to Moravia, they progressed from a backward frontier settlement to a more sedate community with neat frame houses in the town center. Settled by the United Brethren in Christ, an evangelical denomination that later merged with the United Methodist Church, Moravia was already a stronghold of temperance and anti-slavery sentiment. It boasted a hotel, general store, cotton mill, and congregational church. Even today, Moravia is a quaintly authentic piece of Americana, with graceful shady streets that have a companionable feel, and houses with wide, friendly verandas. The Rockefellers lived on the rural outskirts north of town. Around 1843, Bill put down $1,000 for a 92-acre parcel of grassy upland that gently sloped down to Owasco Lake, one of the most picturesque of the Finger Lakes. He enlarged an existing house until it contained 7 or 8 rooms favored with superb views, framed by tall pines, of the bright blue lake set against a backdrop of wooded hills on the far shore. Barns stood across the road, and the smokehouse out back enabled the family to cure ham and bacon. For John Dee, this 2-story clapboard house was a scene of enchantment, and became his enduring emblem of pastoral beauty. In the summertime, he loved to pull yellow perch from the cold, clear lake, and even winters captivated him in spite of the bitter cold. The Rockefeller children slept in an unplastered upstairs room that was heated only by a stovepipe rising from the kitchen. Snow flurries and sharp winter squalls pressed through cracks in the walls. How the wind used to roar among the hemlocks by the shore of the lake, Rockefeller remembered dreamily in his late 70s. In the pre-dawn dark, the children were often awakened by the sharp chopping of woodcutters or the squeal of sleds on hard-packed snow. Eliza would stand at the foot of the stairs and call up to her eldest son, "Come, my son, time to get up and milk your cow." To warm his feet in the dim, cold barn, John always stood on the steaming earth just vacated by the cow he was milking. The first 3 Rockefeller children, Lucy, John, and William, had been born in Richford. Now, in 1843, with Big Bill again on the road during months of her pregnancy, Eliza gave birth to a second daughter, Mary Ann. 2 years later, twins arrived. The boy, Frank, was healthy, but Frances was sickly from birth and received some 70 visits from a local doctor before she died just short of her 2nd birthday. Eliza tried to protect the 7-year-old John Dee from this first lacerating brush with death, but it remained engraved in his memory. When he visited Moravia as an old man in his 80s, he pointed to a field and explained that when Frances was buried, I was sent over to that field to pick stones, that I should not know. He later exhibited an unacknowledged dread of death, and Eliza was perhaps the first to intuit it. In Moravia, William Avery Rockefeller acted like a strange amalgam of solid citizen and engaging ne'er-do-well. As in Richford, the townsfolk goggled as he sped by on swift horses, decked out in smart clothes, and his prodigal spending sometimes fostered the impression that he was the town's richest man. Mary Ann later dismissed the ridiculous stories of their childhood poverty. We always had plenty to eat and wear and every reasonable kind of comfort. We were not rich, of course, far from it. But we had enough to eat and use and save, always. Moravia was the golden period of John's boyhood when his father briefly aspired to gentility. One neighbor even fulfilled the most notable Since the region was rich in pristine pine forests, he organized a legitimate and quite successful logging business. Before dawn, guided only by starlight and lanterns, he and his work gangs carted logs to the lakeside by bobsled, then floated them up to Auburn, situated at the lake's northern tip. In a sudden burst of civic spirit, Bill helped to select the site for the town's school, counting the revolutions of his buggy wheels as he drove through town, then placing the school at the exact middle of the community. He persuaded local taxpayers to pay for it at a time when many people still thought families should educate their children at home. With the resourceful, go-getter attitude later transmitted to his son, Bill also stocked the Owasco Lake with pickerel, and even headed the local temperance committee. That's the kind of man he was, boasted John Dee. He'd get a thing done while his neighbors were beginning to talk about it. The Moravia period revealed an important truth about Bill. He had an underlying craving for respectability. He probably didn't plan to spend his whole life as a floating charlatan, pressed on a bellowhole. Bill never deigned to dirty his hands with farm work, of course, which he considered beneath his dignity. He hired a railroad worker named Hiram Bell to work the farm and look after his family during his frequent wanderings. As Bill instructed him, their mother ain't strong enough to manage them, and they need some managing. Do just what you think is right for them. While Odell cultivated the garden in his spare time, Eliza assigned chores to the children. Drawing a string across the garden one day, she told the two oldest boys, "John, you take care of this side of the string, and Will, this side is yours." In contrast to his father's disdain for manual labor, John, always a self-styled son of the common people, gloried in the rigors of country life, which, he came to believe, toughened him for later industrial struggle. His frugal boyhood hardened an already stoic nature and made him proof against later adversity. There was enough economic activity in the America of the 1840s to stimulate the fancy of any future mogul. Banks sprang up everywhere, canals cross-hatched the countryside, steamboats plied the rivers, railroads and telegraphs welded together the first national markets. Territorial expansion was in the air. Texas was annexed in 1845, and war with Mexico seemed inevitable. Though only dimly aware of such distant developments, John D. Rockefeller already seemed a perfect specimen of Homo economicus. Even as a boy, he bought candy by the pound, divided it into small portions, then sold it at a tidy profit to his siblings. By age 7, encouraged by his mother, he was dropping gold, silver, and copper coins that he earned into a blue china bowl on the mantel. John's first business coup came at age 7, when he shadowed a turkey hen as it waddled off into the woods, raided its nest, and raised the chicks for sale. To spur his enterprise, Eliza gave him milk curds to feed the turkeys, and the next year he raised an even larger brood. As an old man, Rockefeller said, "To this day, I enjoy the sight of a flock of turkeys, and never miss an opportunity of studying them." Despite Rockefeller's roseate memories, early photos of him tell a much more somber tale. His face was grim, expressionless, lacking boyish joy and animation. The skin is drawn, the eyes blank and devoid of luster. To other people, he often seemed abstracted, and they remembered him with a deadpan face, trudging along country roads, lost in thought, as if unraveling deep problems. "He was a quiet boy," said one Moravia resident. "He seemed always to be thinking." In many respects, John was forgettable and indistinguishable from many other boys. When he later dazzled the world, many former neighbors and classmates struggled to summon up even a fuzzy image of him. He was a slow learner, but patient and persistent, and like J.P. Morgan and Jay Gould, exhibited a terrific head for math. "I was not an easy student, and I had to apply myself diligently to prepare my lessons," said Rockefeller, who described himself accurately as reliable, if not brilliant. For 30 weeks per year, rural children needed time off for farm chores. He attended the one-room schoolhouse established by his father, a spare white building with a pitched roof and windows adorned with dark shutters. Discipline was harsh and exacting. When students misbehaved, the teacher menacingly held a slate over their heads. If Rockefeller didn't excel in class, it might have been in part because he lacked the bright boy's exhibitionism, the yearning for gold stars. Always inner-directed and indifferent to the approval of others, he was therefore free of a certain boyish vanity. With the benefit of hindsight, we can see that there was something extraordinary about the way this solid boy pinpointed goals and doggedly pursued them without any trace of childish impulsiveness. When playing checkers or chess, he showed exceptional caution, studying each move at length, working out every possible counter-move in his head. "I'll move just as soon as I get it figured out," he told opponents who tried to rush him. "You don't think I'm playing to get beaten, do you?" To ensure that he won, he submitted to games only where he could dictate the rules. Despite his slow, ponderous style, once he had thoroughly mulled over his plan of action, he had the power of quick decision. Although he was generally brave and devoted much time to books, music, and church, he had a sly wit, the sort that curled up unexpectedly around the edges of a sentence. As his sister-in-law said, he had a great sense of humor, though one might say he was soberly mirthful. His appreciation was keen, but I do not recall him as ever laughing loudly. But I do remember the quick lighting up of his eyes and the dimples that showed in his cheek when he heard or saw anything amusing. His sister Marianne remembered him as an inveterate teaser. He would plague us all with his jokes, always with a straight, solemn face. Rockefeller always had a droll sense of fun, but it was often obscured behind a mask of gravity. John D. Rockefeller was drawn to the church, not as some nagging duty or obligation, but as something deeply refreshing to the soul. The Baptist church of his boyhood provides many clues to the secrets of his character. As a young man, he was raised on a steady diet of maxims, grounded in evangelical Protestantism that guided his conduct. Many of his puritanical attitudes, which may seem antiquated to a later generation, were merely the religious commonplaces of his boyhood. Indeed, the saga of his monumental business feats is inseparable from the fire and brimstone atmosphere that engulfed upstate New York in his childhood. Even his father, wont to flirt with the devil's company, knew many hymns by heart and urged his children to go to church. He once offered John $5 to read the Bible cover to cover, thus creating an early unintentional association between God and money. Always an iconoclastic outlaw spirit, Phil never actually joined the church. That would have been going too far. So John identified religion with his beloved mother, the Bible of Bob ordered. John attended a Sunday school a short distance from their hilltop house, and remembered the teacher as a formerly profane man who had repented and become an earnest Christian. The boy saw religion less as a system of otherworldly rewards than as a means for moral reformation on earth. Since Bill was often away, Eliza coaxed the Presbyterian neighbor into dropping off her and the children at the Baptist church on Sunday morning. As the family huddled together in a pew, Eliza encouraged the children to drop pennies into the collection plate. Rockefeller later cited his mother's altruism as the genesis of his philanthropy. Early in life, he learned that God wanted his flock to earn money and then donate money in a never-ending process. "I was trained from the beginning to work and to save," Rockefeller explained. "I have always regarded it as a religious duty to get all I could honorably and to give all I could. I was taught that way by the minister when I was a boy." The Low Church Baptists didn't prohibit the accumulation of wealth, but did oppose its vain, ostentatious display, setting up a tension that would be threaded throughout Rockefeller's life. While the First Baptist Church had been founded by Roger Williams in Rhode Island in 1639, the denomination didn't flourish until the so-called Great Awakening that began around 1739. This upsurge of religious fervor gathered force following the tour of the Eastern Seaboard by the charismatic English Methodist evangelist George Whitefield. In open fields, amid much weeping, shrieking, fainting, and guilty writhing on the ground, masses of people were converted to Christianity or had their sagging faith restored. This period of rabid emotion spurred fantastic growth among Baptists, who believed in voluntary immersion and the public confession of faith from adherents. More than 100 new Baptist churches sprang up in New England alone. With their lay leaders and autonomous congregations, the Baptists were ideally suited to frontier areas and the democratic ethos of the colonists. Recruited from the common people, often unpaid and poorly educated, Baptist ministers ventured into the hinterlands where other clergymen feared to tread. Because they opposed religious establishments and owed no allegiance to supervisory bishops or the central church hierarchy, they could start up a church in any creek or hollow. They emerged as a major religious force by the close of the 18th century. The Second Great Awakening aroused New England and the mid-Atlantic states to a new pitch of religious fever from 1800 to the late 1830s. This protracted movement peaked around 1830, when the revival fires blazed so hotly that Rochester and other sections of upstate New York and Ohio were dubbed the Burned-Over District. When revivalists, of whom Charles Grandison Finney was the most celebrated, arrived in town, they held prayer meetings that often lasted through the night. These theatrical spectacles, marked by dramatic outpourings of emotion, featured hardened sinners who sat on the anxious bench, as townspeople publicly urged them to repent. When they saw the light, the guilty parties often burst into tears and knelt in prayer. Preachers tried to reach people through vivid appeals to hope and fear, invoking heavenly bliss and burning lakes of hellfire. Popular evangelist Jacob Knapp described tormented sinners crawling up the sides of burning pits while devils with pitchforks perched on the rim sadistically prodded them back down into the flame. The revival movement was self-perpetuating, for the saved were expected to rescue others from Satan's clutches.
Revival.
Would go door to door trying to flush sinners from their homes.
Revival.
Until the entire town was caught up in passionate, hysterical emotion. Several aspects of this revival movement are worth noting because they are so strikingly reflected in Rockefeller's life. In the late 1820s, militant evangelicals in Rochester agitated against smoking, dancing, card-playing, billiards, and the theater, while boycotting stores that opened on the Sabbath. As Rockefeller said, Going back to my early business days in boyhood, the Baptists I knew listened to their consciences and their religious instructions. Not only did not dance in public places, but did not dance anywhere, and did not even concede the reputability of dancing. The theater was considered a source of depravity to be shunned by conscientious Christians. Because liquor was considered a satanic brew, a believer couldn't make it, sell it, or offer it to guests. The temperance pledge became a standard component of accepting Christ into one's life. In his boyhood, Rockefeller internalized an abiding sense that the professing Christian had to be a soldier armed against all secular temptation and must never stray far from godly circles. Departing from strict Calvinism, Baptist evangelicals clung to the egalitarian view that all errant souls could be saved, not just a small predestined elect, and they actively engaged in evangelism and missionary work. Rockefeller was that nobody was ever irretrievably lost. The people were free agents who could be redeemed by an act of will, a self-reliant outlook that stamped his conservative political views. His Baptist upbringing was in century American culture. Kenny, for instance, was a Presbyterian who exhorted his listeners to pursue perfection in their earthly lives. Rockefeller entered the Baptist Church at a fateful moment. In May 1845, in a schism over the issue of slaveholders serving as missionaries, Baptist delegates from 9 southern states seceded from the national body to create the Southern Baptist Convention. Baptists fervently believed that abolitionism was consistent with their opposition to ecclesiastical hierarchy, their populist spirit, and their broad-based campaign to purge sin from society. The Second Great Awakening had explicitly linked personal conversion with community reform, spawning political activism. During the colonial period, Americans had liberally consumed demon rum, but the new evangelical emphasis on social uplift helped to foster a national temperance movement in the 1820s and 1830s. For Rockefeller, an apolitical man, the church narrowed his social life but widened his vision, providing a bridge to larger social concerns and ultimately preparing him for the world of philanthropy. If John Dee believed, despite the flamboyant antics of Devil Bill, that he had enjoyed a homespun boyhood out of a Perrier and Ives print, it was largely due to the compensating influence of Eliza and the church. Her hardships tapped some deep reserve of strength and wisdom in the simple country woman with the spare face, quiet ways, and steady blue-gray eyes. Mother was wonderful, said Marianne. She managed the family and the house and did it all so easily. Though Eliza dutifully read the Bible, her few surviving missives reveal an extremely rudimentary education. She misspelled the most elementary words, writing herd, H-E-R-D, for H-E-A-R-D, pleasant, P-L-E-S-A-N-T, for P-L-E-A-S-A-N-T, and bin, B-E-N, for B-E-E-N. John was a faultless speller and grammarian. All but a stranger to grammar, she sometimes wrote letters that consisted of a single run-on sentence. It is hard not to be stirred by Eliza's uncomplaining bravery in steadily tending 5 children in the face of her husband's erratic, irresponsible ways. When Bill was on the road, she never knew where he was, what he was doing, or when he might surface again. Though she had Hiram Odell and her father lived just across Owasco Lake, Eliza was often alone with the children at night in a town on the fringe of a wilderness. As she thumbed her Bible and puffed on a corncob pipe, she must have worried about roving thieves. One of Rockefeller's favorite stories reveals her cool-headed response to danger. Mother had whooping cough and was staying in her room so that we should not catch it. When she heard thieves trying to get at the back of the house and remembered that there was no man to protect us, she softly opened the window and began to sing some old Negro melody, just as if the family were up and about. The robbers turned away from the house, crossed the road to the carriage house, stole a set of harness, and went down the hill to their boat on the shore. From such early experiences, John Dee took away a deep, abiding respect for women. Unlike other moguls of the Gilded Age, he never saw them in purely ornamental terms. Born in 1813, Eliza had grown up in the shadow of the Second Great Awakening and was never lax about discipline. While Devil Bill dispensed gifts to the children, Eliza by default meted out punishment and tried to subdue the wild Rockefeller streak in her children. A kindred spirit, John accepted her stern country justice when she drew out the birch switch, strapped him to the apple tree, and laid on McDuff, as she styled it. On those occasions I made my protests, which she heard sympathetically and accepted sweetly. But she still laid on, explaining that I had earned the punishment and must have it, Rockefeller recalled. She would say, I'm doing this in love. She typically erred on the side of severity. Once, while punishing John for misbehavior at school, he started to plead his innocence. Never mind, she interrupted. We have started in on this whipping, and it will do for the next time. Rockefeller told a tale of his adolescence that highlighted his mother's grim discipline. They then lived in Owego, and she had forbidden him to ice skate on the Susquehanna River, but the lure of a moonlit night overwhelmed the better judgment of John and his brother William. They were gliding along the river when they heard the desperate cries of a young boy who had fallen through the ice. Pushing a pole to the flailing boy, John and William fished him from the water and saved his life. When they returned home, Eliza hailed their courage, then promptly got down to business. We thought we should be let off without punishment, said Rockefeller, but Mother gave us a good canning nevertheless. Where William and Frank had their father's broad face and high forehead, John had Eliza's narrow face, piercing eyes, and sharp chin, and a personality that conformed more to the Davison pattern. He also had his mother's slow metabolism and ability to bear large burdens for long periods in an unruffled way. Many neighbors testified that the unflappable Eliza never lost her temper, never raised her voice, never scolded anyone, a style of understated authority that John inherited. From his mother, he learned economy, order, thrift, and other bourgeois virtues that figured so largely in his success at Standard Oil. Forced to pay a heavy penalty for her impetuous decision to marry Devil Bill, Eliza trained her children to reflect coolly before making decisions. Her frequent admonition, "We will let it simmer," was a saying John employed throughout his business career. For a woman of Eliza's intense pride and religiosity, it must have been hard to endure the unaccountable absences of her gallivanting husband, and she drew closer of necessity to her oldest son, whose was prematurely wise. She saw qualities in him still invisible to the world at large. Because she confided in him and gave him adult responsibilities, he matured rapidly, acquired unusual confidence. It must have flattered his pride that he served as a surrogate father and was so vital to the family's survival. His relations with his siblings seemed more paternal than fraternal, and he often instructed them. As he put it, I know that in my own case I've been greatly helped by the confidence imposed on me since early boyhood. Of course, this boyhood responsibility took its toll on John D., who experienced little of the spontaneous joy or levity of youth. Growing up as a miniature adult, burdened with duties, he developed an exaggerated sense of responsibility that would be evident throughout his life. He learned to see himself as a reluctant savior, taking charge of troubled situations that needed to be remedied. Until he came to appraise him through more mature eyes, John idolized his father. A man capable of Paul Bunyan-esque feats, William Avery Rockefeller possessed the dash and virility that every young boy dreams of in a father. I come of a strong family, men of unusual strength, a family of giants, Rockefeller stated later in life. What a bright smile my father had. Everybody liked him. Uncle Billy, they called him. By all accounts, Bill was a man of abundant talent. He was such a superb athlete that he could stand beside a fence and jump over it backward. Such an amazing ventriloquist that he could create half a dozen characters talking at once. Such a legendary animal trainer that he once taught tricks to a pet bear he had won in a shooting competition. And such a skillful hypnotist that he was darkly rumored to throw a mist around person and beast alike. If the children associated Eliza with discipline, they identified Bill with laughter, plenty, and good times. He was the ideal hunting and fishing buddy, the crack shot who could bring down small birds in flight. Mesmerized by guns, he kept a splendid set of clean, well-oiled rifles, including one with a telescopic sight in the Moravia house. Taking aim at a pine tree while standing in a meadow, he would toss off rapid shots until the bark was shredded by bullets. When selling patent medicines, his marksmanship served him extremely well, for he would use it to draw a crowd in strange towns. Setting up a mannequin with a clay pipe in its mouth, he retreated to a distance of 200 paces, shot the pipe to smithereens, then offered a $10 bill to anybody in the crowd who could match his growl. Lively and fun-loving, Bill created infectious merriment wherever he went. As his son noted, he always wanted something going on in the house, singing or music of some sort. He was nothing if not shrewd, and used his talents to further his enjoyment. One day he heard of a violin virtuoso who had been clapped in the town jail for drunkenness. The offender was given a choice. Either he could pay a $100 fine or serve 100 days in jail, with each day served reducing the fine by $1. Unable to muster the $100, Bill let the musician stew for 35 days, then bailed him out for $65, taking his violin in exchange. For decades, Bill cherished this rich-toned, concert-quality instrument, which he would bow at waist level like a country fiddler. It was undoubtedly from the Rockefeller side of the family that John inherited his lasting love of music. With the Wasco Lake always shimmering through the window, many of John Dee's dearest memories of Moravia centered upon fishing with Bill, who was prone to do outrageous things in the boat. During one lake outing, the middle brother, William, then a fat little boy unable to swim, made the mistake of grumbling about the heat. Then cool off, his father, who plucked up the flabbergasted boy by the waistband and pitched him headlong into the water. When William sank straight to the bottom, Big Bill dived overboard, retrieved him, then tried to teach him to swim. As John said of the incident, looking on the bright side, he was always training us to meet responsibilities and take care of ourselves. It would be wrong, if highly tempting, to see William Avery Rockefeller as simply some blithe, hedonistic spirit, for he was moralistic in his own way. He was a militant temperance advocate, alcohol having ruined his father, Godfrey, and he fiercely reproached John and William when he caught them smoking in the barn. When, after my brother had reached the age of 40 years, my father learned that he smoked, tears came into his eyes, said John, who liked to focus on his father's virtuous side as a convenient way to sidestep his vices. In no area did Bill impress his eldest son more, or did his eldest son prove more impressionable than in the magic realm of money. Big Bill had an almost sensual love of cash and enjoyed flashing plump rolls of bills. John D. Rockefeller inherited his shrewdness and love of money from his father, remarked one of Bill's companions. The old man had a passion for money that amounted almost to a craze. I never met a man who had such a love of money. Exhibiting a small-town populist mistrust of banks, a mistrust he would pass along to John, who later kept Standard Oil free from the talons of Wall Street financiers, Bill stashed away his money at home. As one neighbor recalled, he had money, lots of it. He kept it in a bureau drawer. There, I've seen it. 1s, 2s, 3s. We had $3 bills then. 5s, 10s, 20s, and 50s, all corded like wood, and the bundles tied with twine, the stacks filling the drawer. According to legend, he also had a 4-gallon pail brimming with gold pieces, that would probably conceal base metal beneath the glittering surface. Once at a family gathering, Bill disappeared for a time, then suddenly burst forth from his room with a patchwork tablecloth crafted from banknotes of varying denominations. This was part of his obsessive need to project a big-shot image to conceal the pettiness of his accomplishments. Neither as a boy nor a man did John find anything pathological about his father's money madness, suggesting that he shared the same blind spot. After he had made his gargantuan fortune, he said admiringly of his father, he made a practice of never carrying less than $1,000, and he kept it in his pocket. He was able to take care of himself and was not afraid to carry his money. The bane of John's boyhood wasn't poverty so much as chronic worry about money, and it is easy to see how cash came to seem like God's bounty, the blessed stuff that relieved all of life's cares. After the family spent anxious weeks of credit bills and waiting for father's return, Bill would abruptly materialize, a jolly Santa Claus swimming in lucre. He would compensate for his long absence by extravagant shows of generosity with his children. For John, money became associated with these brief but pleasurable interludes when the mercurial father was at home and the Rockefellers functioned as a true family. During the early Moravia years, Big Bill began to train his eldest son in business matters, dispatching him at age 8 or 9 to evaluate and buy cordwood for the house. I knew what a quart of good solid beech and maple wood was, said Rockefeller. My father told me to select only the solid wood and the straight wood, not to put any limbs in it or any punky wood. Of all the lessons John absorbed from his father, perhaps none surpassed in importance that of keeping meticulous accounts. This was a matter of necessity. His wayward life forced his family to husband their credit, closely monitor their often precarious financial situation. When it came to business ethics, Bill was a most curious compound, extremely honorable one moment, a sharpster the next. To his son, he tacitly conveyed the message that commerce was a tough competitive struggle, entitled to outdo the other fellow by any means, fair or foul. He tutored John in a sharp, relentless bargaining style that the latter made famous. The most unorthodox bargainer, Bill once bid $1,000 less for a farm than the owner was asking. To settle matters, he suggested they shoot at a target. Bill won and got his $1,000 discount. As a traveling mountebank selling dubious cures to credulous rural folk, Bill took a dim view of people's intelligence and didn't hesitate to exploit their naive trust. As a boss, Bill patented his own queer style of managing people. During his respectable time in the lumber business, he paid his men well and promptly and was said by his son to be very popular. Yet he had a habit of hiring workers for a spell, informing them politely, "I don't need you any longer," then hiring them again a few days later. What he proudly dubbed his policy of firing and hiring over. If this made him sound like a less than lovable boss, his son applauded the unsettling tactic. It kept the men up on tiptoe, no stagnation among them. Oddly enough, John described his father as most liberal and kindly with his employees, yet eminently practical and keen and wide awake and resourceful. This was one of many areas where he seemed to embroider the truth about Big Bill. But the people he fired and hired again have described Bill as liberal and kindly. John D. Rockefeller portrayed his father as a paragon of business virtue. This was mostly an effort to cover up the shady side of Bill's life. It had a grain of truth. Bill paid his debts punctually and believed implicitly in the sacredness of contracts, taking great pains in writing them up. As John observed, he was very scrupulous to carry out his contracts, particularly that they were clearly understood and carefully drawn, that is, committed to writing. And the training he gave me along those lines was very valuable, has proven so in all my life. In his business career, John D. Rockefeller was accused of many sins, but he took pride in paying his debts promptly and abiding strictly by contracts. He was also accused of mixing the lawless and the honorable, of ignoring ethical niceties in a manner reminiscent of his father. He ultimately followed his father's unscrupulous craft or his mother's stern respectability in steering Standard Oil is the question that weighs most heavily on his historical reputation. So one said of Rockefeller, what he said, what he thought, and what he felt came from his mother, but what he did came from his father, with the addition of a great caution generated by early unpleasantness. The issue is much more complicated than that, but there's no doubt that Rockefeller's achievement arose from the often tense interplay between the two opposing, deeply ingrained tendencies of his nature, his father's daring and his mother's prudence, yoked together under great pressure. Given the paucity of hard evidence about Bill's affairs in Moravia, one is led to rake over the rich folklore he left behind. In 1927, carpenter turned author named Charles Brutcher published a book entitled Joshua, a Man of the Finger Lakes Region, a thinly disguised Romana clay about William Avery Rockefeller. The privately printed 130-page book has become something of a collector's item, with copies often fetching hundreds of dollars. The protagonist is one Rockwell, a.k.a. Big Bill. The author brazenly mingles fact and fiction by reproducing an actual photo of Rockefeller's father in the front. Joshua professes redundantly to be a true story taken from life, and gathers lore about Devil Bill that was still titillating the town gossips in the 1920s. Much of its store of legend came from Melvin Rosecrans, whose father, Joshua, had locked horns with Big Bill in the 1840s. The book presents a slanted, hyperbolic portrait of Bill's career, a compendium of his presumed misdeeds, yet enough details tally with documentary material from other sources that it merits review. According to this potboiler, the masterful and self-confident Big Bill became the terror of the Finger Lakes region, whose evil influence would be felt in every household for miles around. Eliza makes a cameo appearance as a sad-faced little woman, kept ignorant of the true reasons for her husband's mysterious trips. She was always opposed to Big Bill's roving disposition and his evil-minded tendencies. If she suspected wrongdoing, she kept it to herself to spare the children. But the fictional Eliza earned the sympathy of the community, jives with what we know of the real Eliza's Moravia life. The book narrates how Rockwell fell in with a bunch of desperados who stole horses and delivered them to the notorious Loomis Brothers gang. This grave, unsubstantiated charge shadowed Bill in all three New York towns he lived in. Another equally grave charge in the book concerns Dr. William Cooper, cousin of the novelist James Fenimore Cooper. Dr. Cooper disliked Bill and
Oh!
asserts that Rockwell once coerced at gunpoint the reluctant Dr. Cooper to
Ooh!
suddenly afterward took pot shots at the doctor through the blinds of his living room window, narrowly missing him. Rockwell was tries to seduce a young woman working in his house. He openly squires his girlfriends around Moravia in his carriage and takes them rowing on the lake, notwithstanding Eliza's dismay. The poor, long-suffering little woman knew the failings of her dashing mate. She was overpowered by his mastermind and had long since become resigned to her fate. The diabolical Bill is even accused of palming off counterfeit bills. At first, the locals were so petrified of the rough-and-tumble Rockwell that they didn't dare to confront him. Yet Joshua ends as a tale of justice triumph, as Bill's gang is disbanded by an irate citizen. In a climactic courtroom scene, it is proved that Rockwell had paid a black man $10 to steal rafting chains in order to smuggle logs across Owasco Lake. His luck having run out, Bill flees the courtroom, though another gang member serves time in Auburn prison for horse theft. When last seen in the morning, Bill has shifted operations to Owego. Horses again begin to disappear suspiciously. In a shameless bit of press agentry that Bill himself would have savored, Rutcher ends by promising a sequel, adding, "Negotiations are pending for the filming of this gripping story, and its early appearance on the silver screen is assured." In the early 1900s, when Ida Tarbell dispatched a research assistant to upstate New York, he picked up the same allegations of horse theft that flavor the pages of Joshua. Horses were said to have begun vanishing after Big Bill moved first to Richford and later to Moravia. It became noised about the neighborhood that Old Bill's gang were the horse thieves, reported Tarbell's assistant. In 1850, 3 of Bill's cronies, Caleb Palmer, Charles Tidd, and a man named Bates, were arrested for stealing mares. After Tidd turned state's evidence, he provided the testimony that was used to incarcerate Palmer and Bates. It must be stressed that no court records actually connect Bill with the crime, and that biographer Alan Nevins, after much examination, branded the horse-thieving charges ridiculous. Yet the anecdotal evidence can't be so easily dismissed. Tarbell's assistant noted, "Everyone I talked with in Moravia declares that Old Bill was the head of the gang." John Palmer, son of one of the jail's culprits, fingered Bill as the mastermind of the Underground Horse Railroad. "Rockefeller was too smart to be caught," he griped. "He ruined my father and then left him in the lurch." Another tale circulating in upstate New York at the turn of the century contended that Bill had corrupted the village youth by teaching them how to gamble. One ancient resident, Hiram Alley, recalled that the village boys would pay Bill $5 to instruct them in card tricks so they could then fleece other boys. John Dean never commented on allegations against his father, but having never touched cards in his life, scoffed at this particular libel. "If my father had been a gambler, I would have known something about cards, wouldn't I?" Clearly, Devil Bill had a suggestive personality that made imaginations run riot. Some of the stories about him were likely embellished. Yet one charge left behind a more convincing paper trail, beginning with Nancy Brown in Richford. She was a young woman to assist with the housework. And in Moravia, she had a tall, pretty Anne Vanderbilt. 1849, according to papers filed at the Auburn courthouse, William Avery Rockefeller was indicted for assaulting Anne Vanderbilt on May 1st, 1848. Then and there, violently against her will, feloniously did ravish and carnally know her. The rape indictment deepens suspicions that Bill was more than just a charming, flirtatious rogue. The aftermath of the indictment was inconclusive, and the whole affair has been obscured by a heavy fog of speculation. Bill never appeared in court, never went to trial, and was never arrested. Everybody who has examined the case has tripped over the same set of questions. Why was the indictment handed down more than a year after the supposed rape? One feminist scholar has helpfully noted the formidable obstacles placed in the way of women pressing rape charges in those days. Why did the prosecuting attorney never endorse the indictment? Why didn't anybody set off in hot pursuit of Bill when he fled from Cayuga County? Why did Anne Vanderbeek let the matter lapse? Once again, a handful of oral histories suggest a tangled skein of local intrigue. Bill had seduced a young woman named Charlotte Hewitt, whose brothers, Earl and Lou, loathed him for it. One Hewitt brother sat on the jury that indicted Big Bill, leading some to see it as a trumped-up charge, a vendetta by the brothers. Ida Tarbell's assistant devised another theory. "I believe the indictment was quashed. possibly on the understanding that he was to leave the county. This was not unusual procedure in those days. The scandal ended whatever tentative truce Bill had struck with John Davison. Long ruled the day when Bill reached his sensible daughter. During the Moravia, Davison had patched up Bill and lent him $1,000 in 2 installments. One in August 1845, the other in October 1846. Now the rape indictment shattered their still tenuous relationship, lending greater credence to the charge. When Bill informed Davison of the accusation and asked him to post bail, Davison gruffly replied that he was too old a man to go to bail for anyone. Taken aback, Bill replied bitterly that he would leave the county, never see him again. Worried about his 2 outstanding loans, Davison went straight to court, claimed his son-in-law planned to defraud his creditors, and sued him for $1,210.75. For Eliza and her offspring, it must have been a thoroughly humiliating moment when the sheriff and 2 neighbors came to appraise their property and attach all their movable goods in the name of John Davison. Davison also modified his will, placing Eliza's inheritance in the hands of trustees, in all likelihood to keep it safely beyond the eager grasp of his son-in-law. During the second half of 1849, Bill abandoned his family and gadded about the countryside to reconnoiter new towns. In the spring of 1850, the same year Nathaniel Hawthorne published The Scarlet Letter, Bill resettled his family in Owego, near the Pennsylvania border. As a fugitive from justice, he might have wanted to be near the state line whenever trouble loomed. Though only 10 at the time and probably ignorant of what had happened, it's hard to imagine Eliza confiding such scandalous things to a young boy. John later ridiculed the rape charge and mocked the idea of his father fleeing justice. If my father left under compulsion, I should have known something about it. It was nothing of the sort. He moved over to Owego, and if he were fleeing from justice, that wasn't very far away. John's later tendency to minimize the disgrace probably had several causes, ranging from filial piety to shrewd public relations. He knew people bent upon proving his own immorality wanted to buttress their case by first tarnishing his father. One must also note his penchant for denial, his potent capacity to filter out uncomfortable thoughts, especially about his father, just as he later deflected criticism of his questionable business behavior. John D. Rockefeller drew strength by simplifying reality, strongly believed that excessive reflection upon unpleasant but unalterable events only weakened one's resolve in the face of enemies. At some point in his boyhood, however, possibly after the flight from Moravia, John's reverence for his father did begin to be intermingled with more hostile, unexpressed feelings.
Oh.
One writer of a wildly psychoanalytic bent has even suggested that Rockefeller's icy self-control was a reaction to repressed fantasies of murdering his father. In later years, scores of John D's friends and associates noted that Big Bill was a taboo topic that they broached at their peril, one on which John maintained a thoroughgoing silence. As one early biographer remarked, from the beginning to the end of his career, he has made secrecy respecting his father, respecting paternal visits, a matter of religious observance. We cannot tell when Rockefeller first felt shame about his father, but this emotion was so consequential for his entire development that we must pause briefly to consider it. In the towns of John's boyhood, Bill was an engaging but notorious character who prompted interminable speculation about his travels and sources of income. A boy with such a father needed to screen out malicious gossip, cultivate a brazen indifference. This bred in him a reflexive habit of secrecy, fear of the crowd, deep contempt for idle chatter and loose tongues that lasted a lifetime. He learned to cultivate a secretive style and a defiant attitude towards strangers. Perhaps out of a self-protective instinct, Bill taught his children to fear strangers and even of himself. When John was a child, Bill would urge him to leap from his high chair into his waiting arms. One day, he dropped his arms, letting his astonished son crash to the floor. Remember, Bill lectured him, Never trust anyone completely. Somewhat later, walking with his boys through Cleveland, he warned them to ignore the pell-mell rush of people to fires and parades. Never mind the crowd, he told them. Keep away from it. Tend to your own business. Eliza also must have inoculated the children's minds against tale-bearers and told them not to discuss family matters with other people. The boy who faced down the vicious talk of neighbors would be extremely well prepared with unscathed, even defiant, through the turbulent controversies that later surrounded his life. For all the uncertainty of their lives, the Rockefellers, in their restless, driven odyssey across the southern tier of New York, enjoyed a sense of upward mobility as they journeyed from Richford to Moravia to Owego, with each town larger, more prosperous, and more hopeful than its predecessor. The county seat of Tioga County, located south of Richford and west of Binghamton, Owego sits astride a broad, beautiful bend of the Susquehanna River. Decidedly more cosmopolitan than anything young John D. had experienced before, it was a refined village with genteel homes along Front Street that vouchsafed glimpses of a finer life. The incorporated village of Owego had an imposing courthouse, a well-stocked library, a renowned school, and other nascent hints of culture. For a country town of 7,200 people, it also boasted a disproportionate number of resident writers and artists. Perhaps because his sojourn there was shorter, Rockefeller never developed quite the same fond attachment to Owego as to Moravia, but he retained pleasing associations with it. "What a beautiful place Owego is," he once exclaimed. "How fortunate we were to grow up there in a beautiful country with good neighbors, people of culture and refinement, kind friends." With amusement, he recalled how Owego had exploded his provincial boyhood. "Down at the railroad station one day, I saw a Frenchman. Think of that, a real live Frenchman. And he wore a mustache. The first I ever saw." On June 1st, 1849, shortly before the Rockefellers arrived, the Erie Railroad at first puffed into Owego, thousands of spectators packing the hillsides to cheer the train as it slid into the station amid a burst of ceremonial cannonades and pealing church bells. Railroad trains were known even when I was a boy, but they were few, short, and sooty, Rockefeller said of the conveyances that would figure so largely in his own exploits. In small towns like Owego, the railroad ended isolated, self-contained economies, absorbing them into regional and national markets, while also sharpening their inhabitants' appetites for material goods and inviting them to seek their fortunes in distant cities. The Rockefellers lived 3 miles east of town in an area of soft, bucolic meadows and riverine groves. Of the 2 frame houses they occupied during their time in Owego, the second was smaller, suggesting that Bill and Eliza needed to retrench as they grappled with financial problems. The second house, more a cottage than a farm, had a fine view of the winding, muddy Susquehanna, with the wooded silhouette of Big Island, later Hiawatha Island, in the foreground, ringed by a curtain of blue hills in the distance. In these snug quarters, John shared a bed with Brother William. It was a small house, John reminisced years later, but a dear, good house. Bill might have chosen Owego because it had signal business advantages for someone who dabbled in the lumber business. During freshets, log rafts were easily floated down the Susquehanna River, and several lumber mills, in consequence, had sprung up in the town. It might also be significant that on September 27, 1849, right before the Rockefellers moved to Owego, an appalling conflagration had consumed 104 downtown buildings, the blaze sparing only 3 stores. A disaster that presaged a booming business as the town was rebuilt. Finally, the town had a reputation as a mecca for self-styled doctors. As one Owego resident recalled, after the Civil War, there were a dozen of them living there. During the 3 Owego years, Bill's escapades seemed even more bizarrely unpredictable than before. His appearances in town were brief and infrequent, however memorable to the gaping natives. "He was the best-dressed man for miles around," said a close neighbor. "You never saw him without his fine silk hat." Now in her late 30s, Eliza was losing her youthful bloom and developing the hard, thin face that told of her many trials. Many townsfolk recalled her as a sweet, fine, dignified lady who called on neighbors in the afternoon, always clad in a black silk dress that looked like widow's weeds. Everybody commended her unsparing discipline, neat appearance, and commanding presence. For all her travails, she didn't look as forlorn as she had in Moravia. She was growing more accustomed to the burden that she bore, and more reconciled to Bill's absences. Once the swaggering autocratic husband, Bill had now been irredeemably exposed as a scoundrel, and was demoted in Eliza's esteem. Her disillusionment with her handsome husband might have simplified matters in the household. "It was she who brought up the family," said one observer, "for even when he was at home, the father did not interfere with her discipline, and it was discipline." Another neighbor termed her an unusually clear-minded and capable Christian mother. Perhaps her discipline might seem very strict or even severe today, but although she made them obey her and kept them all busily employed, the children all loved her as she loved them. She wasn't a mother to be trifled with. Once, when sick in bed, she discovered that John had neglected to perform a task for her, and judgment was swift. She sent him to the Susquehanna to select a willow switch. With the quiet cunning that would become a pronounced trait of his nature, he nicked the switch in several places with his knife, so it would bend and crack after the initial blows. Eliza wasn't deceived. "Go and get another switch," she instructed him, "and see that it is not slashed this time." Eliza must have found the religious atmosphere in Owego suitably wholesome. One of John's imperishable images of Owego was of standing behind the house and hearing the dutiful Eliza praying aloud in an upstairs bedroom. The local Baptists were enterprising evangelists. Every winter they marched scores of reformed sinners down to the frozen Susquehanna, carved out openings in the ice, and baptized them.
It's alright.
Every Sunday,
It's alright.
Hey, what time you supposed to pick Bonnie up? 7?
7, yeah.
Okay, she said come at 8 instead.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Alright, I'll see you later.
Okay, thank you for telling me.
No problem.
Yeah, bye.
Bruce picked up Eliza and the children and drove them to a Baptist church in the village. Inspired by a Sunday school class on forgiveness, the children initiated a custom that suggests how religion permeated their lives. Each night when they got into bed, they turned to their siblings and said, "Do you forgive me all I have done to you today?" By the time they fell asleep, the air had been cleared of all recriminations or festering anger. In Owego, Eliza increased her dependence on John, as if training him to be everything Bill wasn't. Like his mother, John seemed stronger without Bill, able to escape his shadow and forge a separate identity. His manifold duties habituated him to a heavy workload. When not attending school, he cut wood, milked the cow, drew well water, tended the garden, and went on shopping expeditions while also supervising his younger siblings in their mother's absence. "I was taught to do as much business at the age of 10 or 11 as it was possible for me to do," he later noted. As the stand-in for Bill, he kept a tight rein on the family budget and learned to appraise the world shrewdly. Once he spent 3 days helping a local farmer dig potatoes for 37.5 cents per day. This set up an instructive contrast for the frugal boy when, soon afterward, he loaned one farmer $50 at 7% interest and collected $3.50 at year's end, without a stitch of work. He was thunderstruck by the happy math, which hit him with the force of a revelation. The impression was gaining ground with me that it was a good thing to let the money be my slave and not make myself a slave to money. Brother William, a good-natured boy who pitched in with gusto and never asked too many questions, was far more popular with the local farmers. whereas the more rational John analyzed work, broke it down into component parts, and figured out how to
Ah!
economically. Throughout his life, John D. Rockefeller Sr. reacted in a vitriolic manner to accusations that he had lusted after money as a child and yearned to be fabulously rich. Doubtless embarrassed, he contested insinuations that he was motivated by greed instead of a humble desire to serve God or humanity. He preferred to portray his fortune as a pleasant accident, the unsought byproduct of hard work. Yet stories surface of Rockefeller daydreaming about money in Owego when he was only in his early teens. One day, strolling by the Susquehanna with a friend, he blurted out, "Someday, sometime, when I'm a man, I want to be worth $100,000. And I'm going to be too, someday." Nearly identical accounts come from so many sources that one is forced to conclude inconveniently expired. Given his father's panting ardor for money, it would have been strange had he not been bewitched by gold. There was nothing unusual about Rockefeller's boyhood dreams, for the times were feeding avaricious fantasies in millions of susceptible schoolboys. Antebellum America was a place of high adventure and unbounded opportunity for industrious young men. Following the war with Mexico, huge chunks of land, Texas, New Mexico, and Upper California, were annexed to the country in early 1848. That same year, gold was discovered at John Sutter's sawmill in California, triggering a mad westward rush of 90,000 prospectors. Just as the Rockefellers were moving from Moravia to Owego, hordes of frantic men swarmed across the continent, sailed around South America, or slogged across the Isthmus of Panama, hell-bent to reach California. The pandemonium foreshadowed the petroleum craze in western Pennsylvania a decade later. Though the gold rush proved a snare and a delusion for most miners, the occasional success stories nonetheless inflamed the popular imagination. Mark Twain singled out the California gold rush as the watershed event that sanctified a new money worship and debased the country's founding ideals. Before he left Owego, John secured a first-rate education, then a rarity in rural America, where few children attended secondary school. At first, the Rockefeller children went to a schoolhouse a short walk from their house. Due to the family's straitened circumstances, a friendly neighbor purchased their textbooks. In August 1852, John and William entered Owego Academy, which had been founded in 1827 and was unquestionably the finest secondary school in that part of New York. Topped by a tall steeple, fenced in by lovely parkland, the three-story brick school building must have awed the still rustic Rockefeller boys. Presiding over the academy was an able scout, Dr. William Smith, who made the students hone their verbal skills by writing fortnightly essays and delivering speeches on assigned themes. The linguistic skills mastered at Owego became evident in Rockefeller's concise business letters. The school produced many eminent graduates, including Thomas C. Platt, later the easy boss who ran the New York Republican machine, and Washington Gladden, the preacher who issued some of the most scorching screeds directed against standard order. Many of the 350 pupils came from affluent urban families. John later lauded this exposure to city boys, saying it was bound to benefit country boys. The school charged a steep tuition of $3 per term, suggesting that Bill's Medical Roadshow was finally prospering after 2 years in Owego. John never expressed resentment at being, by academy standards, a poor boy. When a photographer came to shoot class pictures, John and William were excluded because their suits were too shabby. Other boys might have smarted, but John always prized his daguerreotypes of his fellow scholars, later insisting, "I would not part with this collection for any money." In Eliza Rockefeller's household, one didn't morbidly dwell on slights, but kept one's sights fixed on the practical goals ahead. John never aspired to popularity at the school. It was as if, after the inordinate attention that his father attracted, John wanted to be quiet and inconspicuous and blend into the crowd. While many well-to-do students boarded at the school, the Rockefeller boys undertook a 3-mile hike to school every morning, and, like many students, wandered barefoot down the dusty lanes in warm weather. This long trek led John past fine, imposing homes with well-trimmed lawns facing the Susquehanna River. With his slow, deliberate pace, he often set out early, reflected in an unhurried manner as he walked, his eyes always fixed on the ground ahead. Not averse to taking shortcuts, however, he sometimes sat by the roadside and asked passing teamsters for a lift. John was a plodding, lackluster student with no discernible trace of brilliance. Only one aspect of school life truly seemed to intrigue him. Every Saturday, the principal demonstrated the newfangled devices then revolutionizing American business, and John was riveted by displays of a telegraph instrument invented by Samuel F. B. Morse in 1837, galvanic batteries, and other modern contrivances. Such things captured his mind more than the rousing social issues raised by Harriet Beecher Stowe in Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was published in 1852, in horrified response to the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. To the extent that Rockefeller children had difficulties with schoolwork, it stemmed from the chaotic situation at home. For 5 growing, energetic children, their small cottage was noisy and cramped. Each evening, Eliza packed her brood off to a teenage neighbor named Susan Lamont, who tutored them and ensured that they completed their homework. She remembered William and Frank as typically mischievous boys, kicking and teasing each other, while John was oddly self-possessed, already a boy man, a model of adult decorum. I have no recollection of John excelling at anything. I do remember he worked hard at everything, not talking much and studying with great industry. There was nothing about him to make anybody pay especial attention to him or speculate about his future. An 1852 photo of the Rockefeller children shows John, age 13, William, 11, and Mary Ann, 9, sitting in the inky gloom of a photo studio. They are a cheerless trio as they stare blankly into the camera. Wearing a plaid suit and with his hair neatly brushed back from a wide forehead, John has a long, impassive face. His expression is inscrutable. William has a softer, rounder face, and his garments, including a polka-dotted vest and a watch chain, suggest his father's more outgoing personality. Mary Ann wears the plain dress of a farm girl, her hair in pigtails and parted down the middle. Although the group portrait suggests middle-class respectability, its somber mood, which also must owe something to the slower photography of the day, discloses something less than the idyllic boyhood John liked to evoke. The drudgery of daily life was often leavened by play, as John had his first flirt with young ladies, and he exhibited flashes of droll wit. One afternoon at a Sunday he was perhaps 12, he passed ladies seated before heaps of food and observed, "Remember, girls, if you eat slowly, you can eat more." Rockefeller was intensely aware of the opposite sex, yet, knowing of his father's history, kept his impulses under tight control. Susan Lamont saw a sensitivity in the boy that escaped casual observers. She was struck by his great admiration of beauty. There was a little girl going to school near our home, a pretty little thing named Freer, with red cheeks and bright eyes and a sweet face. In after years, Mr. Rockefeller would ask for her, and when she was left a widow in distress, he aided her with a modest pension. Susan Lamont saw that the boy's eerie self-discipline concealed a deep fund of emotion, and she remembered the ceremony of grief he went through when one of her sisters died. On the day she died, John came to our house and stretched out on the ground and would not go away. He was so sorry that he would not go away but lay there all day. Such stories reveal a sensitivity in Rockefeller that would always be there, but that would later be studiously concealed behind the polished facade of the hard-driving businessman. Chapter 3. Bound to be Rich. As a roving salesman, William Avery Rockefeller was fast becoming a relic of an earlier America when markets were extended, not by new methods of communication or transportation, but by the salesman simply covering more ground. A magnetic pull lured Big Bill even farther west, away from the burgeoning cities and industries of the eastern seaboard, and toward remote hamlets on the American frontier. In early 1853, the Rockefellers were again uprooted and swept along in the whirlwind of Bill's life when he took them by train to a prairie town in Ohio called Strongsville, about a dozen miles southwest of Cleveland. At this juncture, Bill quietly began to distance himself from his dazed family, having formed a new romantic attachment that proved far deeper than earlier infidelities, and that finally severed his familial ties. Where Eliza and the children had at least enjoyed their own homes in Richford, Moravia, and Owego, retaining some modicum of dignity, Bill now dumped them at the home of his sister and brother-in-law, Sarah Ann and William Humiston, paying his relatives $300 a year to board his clan. To his hapless family, this must have seemed, after all their wanderings, terribly unfair. Their lives had always been uncommonly restless, but now they were cast-offs, pariahs in a strange new Ohio town, tumbling back down the social ladder they had so arduously climbed. The 6 Rockefellers were squashed into a small house with 6 or 7 Humistons, even though Bill seems to have been flush with cash at the time. Years later, Billy Humiston insisted that Devil Bill was considered rich, that he gave out loans at hefty rates, kept 3 or 4 fine guns, stocked a rich wardrobe, and sported diamond rings and a gold watch, all of which suggested that the abrupt move to Ohio was less a matter of financial stringency than of personal convenience. The Humistons greatly admired Eliza for her excellent business head and thrifty money management, but enormous tension was bottled up in the overcrowded Humiston household. Billy Jr. later portrayed his cousins William and Frank as very rowdy, and John as a prig. John was just such a boy as he is a man, sanctimonious and precise. Fortunately for all concerned, the Rockefellers soon moved out and took up residence on a small farm at the edge of Strongsville. By now, Big Bill had relinquished all interest in lumber and other settled trades, and had permanently assumed the persona of the rambling doctor or botanic physician, as he was soon listed in the Cleveland Directory. In the first year after he deposited his family in Strongsville, Bill returned only 3 or 4 times, but by a curious fluke, the townspeople learned a good deal about his fraudulent activities on the road. One day, a Strongsville resident, Joe Webster, checked into a hotel in Richfield, Ohio, and was stunned to see a sign in the lobby trumpeting the news, "Dr. William A. Rockefeller, the celebrated cancer specialist, here for 1 day only. All cases of cancer cured unless too far gone, and then can be greatly benefited." Soon after, with the smooth vaudevillian patter employed by so many patent medicine vendors, Bill collected a crowd outside the hotel. Standing up in his buggy, his sign propped against the wheels, a showman in a silk hat, black frock coat, and dark red beard, he presented himself as Doc Rockefeller and offered full-fledged cancer cures for the extremely steep price of $25. Those strapped for cash could purchase cheaper bottles of medicine. When Webster approached him afterward, Bill wasn't abashed and bragged that he had lately been doctoring as far afield as Iowa and was buying up land there. After Webster returned to Strongsville and told of his startling discovery, word quickly got around town, and everybody thereafter referred to their shadowy, footloose neighbor as Doc Rockefeller, doubtless with some mirth. The moniker stuck. In the fall of 1853, after 8 months in Strongsville, Big Bill decided that the time had come for John and William to resume their educations. So he drove them into Cleveland and settled them as boarders with the Mrs. Wooden on Erie Street, where they paid $1 a week for room and board. John was penalized by the Cleveland schools because his family had moved around so much. In the sole extant reference to the matter, he wrote in 1923, "I had just come from New York State and recall my humiliation in being obliged to remain 1 term in the old Clinton Street School. I had been for several years in the Owego Academy, and supposed I should go at once into the high school instead of the grammar school." For this proud boy, the demotion must have been one of the many small but wounding indignities suffered during these anxious years. When John finally entered high school, later called Central High School, in 1854 at the age of 15, it was still a modest 1-story affair, shaded by trees and standing behind a clean white picket fence. It would receive a much fancier new building in 1856. Operating on the progressive theory of free education for boys and girls, the school enjoyed a superb reputation. Since it stressed composition, John had to submit essays on 4 topics to advance to the next grade: education, freedom, the character of St. Patrick, and recollections of the past. At a time when America was deeply split over the question of extending slavery to new territories, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed in May 1854, these writings exhibit Rockefeller as a young Democrat and confirmed abolitionist. In Freedom, he branded it a violation of the laws of our country and the laws of our God that man should hold his fellow man in bondage. Unless slavery was curbed speedily, he prophesied, it will end in the ruin of our country. America would only progress, he believed, with an educated citizenry. In former times, when learning was confined to the monks and priests, then it was that the world stood still, and it was not until the people were educated and began to think for themselves that it progressed. Such views on abolitionism and universal literacy echoed those of Northern Baptist evangelicals who scorned political no less than ecclesiastical despotism. As a self-made man, Rockefeller would always deplore aristocracies and priesthoods as effete, reactionary foes of true progress, defenders of privilege against enterprising commoners. Rockefeller expressed himself with great clarity and precision. Schoolmates called him John D. because he signed his essays this way. He also excelled as a debater, demonstrating that beneath his reserved manner he could articulate his thoughts forcefully. He began one speech with the line, "I'm pleased although I'm sad," and this gambit so tickled his fellow students that they nicknamed him Old Pleased Although I'm Sad. He bore another equally doleful nickname, the Deacon, and it says much about his preferences that he actually liked this sobriquet. As his future sister-in-law, Lucy Spellman, said, he was a studious boy, brave, reserved, never noisy or given to boisterous play. Rockefeller frequently hugged his slate to his chest, a pose that hinted at his guarded nature. However private or solitary, John D. always had his quota of friends. One close chum was Mark Hanna, the descendant of well-to-do grocers and commodity brokers, and later a U.S. Senator and Republican Party boss. Another friend, Darwin Jones, who formed a boyhood triumvirate with them, recalled the sharply etched contrast between Hanna and Rockefeller. Mark was of the virile type, always active, and took part in almost all forms of athletics, while John Rockefeller was reserved, studious, though always pleasant. No matter what the excitement, John retained his quietude and smiled on all occasions. In future years, Rockefeller cringed when Mark Hanna was quoted posthumously as describing him as sane in every respect save one, he is money man. As at Owego Academy, classmates in Cleveland remembered Rockefeller voicing the fervent wish to be worth $100,000 someday. John's boyhood gravity pleased many adults, but unsettled others who found something queer and unnatural about him. One high school teacher described him with patent distaste as the coldest-blooded, the quietest, and most deliberate chap. Even as a teenager, Rockefeller demanded to be treated with adult dignity. In recollecting the school principal, Dr. Emerson E. White, Rockefeller mentioned only his behavior toward him. Mr. White was a gentleman. He treated me like a gentleman, and treated all the boys so. Rockefeller was sensitive about adults who behaved in a high-handed fashion toward him. Having assumed so much responsibility at home, he now thought of himself as a mature person. Bill had set him up with his own bank account, and his life was far more independent than those of his classmates. This tough, self-possessed boy had no tincture of rebellion in his makeup. Seeing his education solely in utilitarian terms, he studied hard but showed no intellectual playfulness. I was very sedate and earnest, he said, preparing to meet the responsibilities of life. Once again, he displayed a fantastic mind for numbers. Arithmetical problems most attracted him, said Lucy Spellman, for he had been taught at home to keep accurate account of his gains and losses. Perhaps the most surprising dimension of John D.'s early adolescence was his deep absorption in music. He even briefly aspired to be a musician, practiced the piano for up to 6 hours a day, driving Eliza mad with the racket while they still lived in Owego. The piano was then the symbol of a decorous middle-class home, and his playing might have hinted at his genteel aspirations. For a man who would distrust other art forms as vaguely subversive, encouraging ungovernable emotions and pagan sensuality, music provided him with an artistic medium that he could wholeheartedly enjoy with church approval. For the teenage boy, Mrs. Wooden's boarding house was an education in itself. Her daughter, Martha, was several years older than John and William, and they engaged in lively, heated discussions on many topics, with the bright, outspoken Mrs. Wooden often joining in. The most controversial topic was lending money at interest. In an extremely peculiar arrangement, John, age 15, was already lending small sums to his father at interest. Never sentimental when it came to business, he simply charged his father what the traffic would bear. A practice Bill probably applauded enthusiastically. According to Rockefeller, Mrs. Wooden was violently opposed to loaners obtaining high rates of interest, and we had frequent and earnest arguments on the subject. It was typical of Rockefeller that this question of business method and morality occupied his attention far more than the esoteric matters found in school books. As if embarrassed by his peripatetic family life, Rockefeller tended to oversimplify the chronology of his early years, especially when speaking of his adolescence. After a year in Strongsville, John claimed, his family moved to Parma, about 7 miles south of Cleveland, then into their own house in Cleveland proper. In fact, he omitted a critical two-step Cleveland detour before the shift to Parma, as can be gleaned from a revealing anecdote told by his school principal, Dr. White. One day in 1854, a tall, angular boy came to me and said that his widowed mother and 2 sisters were coming to Cleveland to live, and he wished my help in finding a temporary home for them. The good-natured White invited the Rockefellers to move in with him and his new bride, and John liked the idea and always insisted that it was a happy time for his mother. 2 words leap from the story: widowed mother. It seems of some psychological significance that the first recorded instance of Rockefeller's capacity to lie came in an effort to hush up his father's existence. In fact, to bury him alive. Since Bill popped up in Cleveland 3 or 4 times a year, it took a certain cheat for his son to invent this story. The small episode acquires added interest when one notes that more than 30 years later, when Eliza died before Bill did, John instructed the preacher to describe her as a widow at the funeral. Further, despite the principal's gracious response, it must have been perfectly dreadful for John as a teenager to go on a begging mission to find temporary lodgings for his family. When Bill reappeared, he moved his family to a house on Perry Street in downtown Cleveland, rented from a Mr. O.J. Hodge, who remembered John as an unassuming youth who showed none of the hilarity often seen in boys at that age. Usually he sat quietly in his chair listening to what was being said. As had been true since the Richford days, Bill was scrupulous about making timely rent payments. Never was rent, $200 for a year, paid more promptly, nor did I have in all respects a better tenant, said the landlord. Before the year was out, Bill had resettled his family on a 10-acre creekside farm in Parma, while John returned to Mrs. Wooden, who had relocated first to St. Clair Street and then to Hamilton Street. A contemporary photo of John with his 2 sisters and 2 brothers, all of them unsmiling, is again drenched in a mortuary gloom. Now, a tall, thin boy who weighed about 140 pounds, John had tidily brushed light brown hair and clothes that were always clean and presentable. He later laughed at his solemn boyhood demeanor. From 14 years of age to 25, I was much more dignified than I am now, he said with truth in his 70s. In Strongsville and Parma, Eliza fretted about the ubiquitous taverns in town and worked hard to shield her children from illicit entertainments. She must have been especially alarmed as her eldest son approached that perilous rite of passage, first love. Interestingly, John D. reenacted his father's penchant for dalliances with the domestic help. In Strongsville, Eliza hired a household assistant, a pretty young farmer's daughter named Melinda Miller, who did chores for the family and shared their meals. When the Rockefellers moved to Parma, Melinda resumed working for them, and John, a year younger than she, often came out from Cleveland to take walks with her. Rumors soon drifted about town that John had taken away the girl's virginity. Whatever the truth, the Millers raised an unholy ruckus about the romance. In one of the less prophetic judgments in parental history, they argued that they didn't want their daughter to throw herself away on a young man with such poor prospects. According to legend, one of Melinda's parents came to fetch her by buggy to break up the liaison. Eventually, she married young Joe Webster, whose father had discovered Big Bill's doctor act. From the standpoint of Rockefeller's career, the failure of this relationship was fortunate, for he ended up with a woman of much greater social standing and intellectual attainment, who would provide him with the strong, stable home life and religious certitude that he craved. At this point, we need to sketch in some events in William Avery Rockefeller's life in the early 1850s, where his behavior began to shade over from the eccentric to the quasi-pathological. A man of multiple disguises, he had always been fond of assuming names. Even when he first arrived in Richford, he had told some people that his name was Rockefeller. During the Owego years, Bill finally appeared in surrounding towns and presented himself as an eye and ear specialist named Dr. William Livingston. We know now that by the time he transplanted his family to Ohio, he was leading a full-blown double life as both Dr. William A. Rockefeller and Dr. William Livingston, the latter name appropriated from the town of his father's birth, Livingston, New York. While his second name probably began as a simple alias to shield his family from his shady practices, it hardened in the early 1850s into a separate identity away from home. Bill's traveling partner in his later years attributed Bill's use of the pseudonym to the fact that he was practicing medicine without a license or diploma, and always feared retribution from indignant local doctors who instigated legal proceedings against him on several occasions. In the last gasp of his lumber career, Bill had ventured north into Canada in the early 1850s, buying up fine walnut and ash and selling it at a handsome profit to timber mills. After he moved to the town of Niagara, Ontario, almost certainly without his family's knowledge, he began to canvass the surrounding countryside as a traveling doctor. Dr. Livingston was a blatant quack, but he partially believed his own bombast and had enough success stories to deceive his patients and perhaps even himself. As his future partner said, he had not studied medicine in any college, but he was a natural healer and had great skill. He had great fame in Canada and northern New York. Devil Bill had an unerring instinct for spotting those pretty, docile, long-suffering women who would patiently endure his escapades. Around 1852, with his oblivious family still in Owego, he met a lovely, gentle teenage girl in Norwich, Ontario, named Margaret Allen. Bill was then 42 and Margaret about 17, or only 4 years older than John Dee. By a small oversight, Dr. Livingston neglected to mention his other life as Doc Rockefeller, to say nothing of his wife and 5 children, and he wooed Margaret like a lusty bachelor. Bill was an expert confidence man, and Margaret's trusting family was totally fooled. He was a steady-tempered man of good habits, kind-hearted, sociable, and well-liked by everybody, said Margaret's sister of this jolly wooer. He was a famous marksman and loved to hunt. He was fond of a good story. Doc Livingston was clearly more popular with the Allens than Doc Rockefeller had been with the Davisons, and Bill was tempted to start afresh with an adoring, innocent young woman, supported by a friendly family. On June 12, 1855, he married Margaret Allen in Nichols, New York, just south of Owego, and started a clandestine life as a bigamist that would persist for the rest of his days. One can plausibly argue that every time Bill moved his family to another town, it related to his secret philandering, and that he probably relocated his family in Cleveland because Ontario lay just across Lake Erie. True to his earlier behavior, Bill didn't take up permanent residence with Margaret at first. To initiate her into his capricious ways, he started out by visiting her in Ontario once a year and staying with her credulous family. He didn't plan at the outset to desert his original family, and for a time in the 1850s, Bill continued to tread a tightrope between his old and new wives, neither of whom knew of the existence of the other. It seems likely that Bill's second marriage had immediate repercussions in the life of his oldest son. All along, John had planned to attend college, with Eliza fortifying his resolve in the hope that he would someday become a Baptist minister. Then he received a letter from his father that dispelled his dreams. As he recalled, "My father conveyed an intimation that I was not to go to college. I felt at once that I must get to work, find a situation somewhere." Rockefeller never clarified why he dropped out of high school around May 1855, just 2 months shy of commencement exercises on July 16th. But Bill's second marriage on June 12th supplies the missing piece of the puzzle. About to enter into his second marriage, Bill must have been drastically scaling back on first family expenditures, albeit without disclosing the reason for the sudden urgency. As John said, "There were younger brothers and sisters to educate, and it seemed wise for me to go into business." Bill was eager to groom his eldest son as the surrogate father who would care for Eliza during his longer absences. Never a great believer in book learning, Bill probably derided a college degree as a costly indulgence at a time when people didn't equate it with enhanced income. Young men on the make were more likely to attend so-called business colleges or to take correspondence courses to supplement their education. Following his father's suggestion, John paid $40 for a 3-month course of study at E.G. Folsom's Commercial College, a chain college with branches in 7 cities. The Cleveland branch occupied the top floor of the Rouse Building, the town's premier office building, which overlooked the public square. It taught double-entry bookkeeping, clear penmanship, penmanship and the essentials of banking, exchange, and commercial law, the sort of purposeful courses that appealed to John. By the time his studies ended in the summer of 1855, he had turned 16 and was ready to flee the traumas of his family life by focusing his energies on a promising business situation. Perhaps no job search in American history has been so mythologized as that begun by 16-year-old John D. Rockefeller in the sweltering Cleveland of August 1855. Although he was a rural boy, his family hadn't been full-time farmers, and this must have made it easier for him to escape from his small-town agricultural past and enter the new market economy. Though times were tough, the boy set out with no modest ambition as he pored over the city directory, identifying those establishments with high credit ratings. Already endowed with instinctive respect for big business, he knew exactly what he wanted. "I went to the railroads, to the banks, to the wholesale merchants," he later said. "I did not go to any small establishments. I did not guess what it would be, but I was after something big." Most of the businesses he visited lay in a bustling area known as the Flats, where the Cuyahoga River twisted through a clanging, roaring landscape of lumber mills, iron foundries, warehouses, and shipyards, before emptying into Lake Erie, which was crowded with side-wheel steamboats and schooners. His quest had a touch of callow grandiosity. At each firm, he asked to speak to the top man, who was usually unavailable, then got straight to the point with an assistant. "I understand bookkeeping, and I'd like to get work." Despite incessant disappointment, he doggedly pursued a position. Each morning, he left his boarding house at 8 o'clock, clothed in a dark suit with a high collar and black tie, to make his rounds of appointed firms. This grimly determined trek went on each day, 6 days a week for 6 consecutive weeks, until late in the afternoon. The streets were so hot and hard that he grew footsore from pacing them. His perseverance surely owed something to his desire to end his reliance upon his fickle father. At one point, Bill suggested that if John didn't find work, he might have to return to the country. The thought of such dependence upon his father made a cold chill run down his spine, Rockefeller later said. Because he approached his job hunt devoid of any doubt or self-pity, he could stare down all discouragement. "I was working every day at my business, the business of looking for work. I put in my full time at this every day." He was a confirmed exponent of positive thinking. With almost 30,000 inhabitants, Cleveland was a boom town that would have thrilled any young man avid for business experience. It had drawn many transplants from New England who had brought along the Puritan mores and Yankee trading culture of their old hometowns. While the streets were largely unpaved and the town lacked a sewage system, Cleveland was expanding rapidly, with immigrants pouring in from Germany and England as well as the eastern seaboard. But plenty of the Midwest passed through this commercial crossroads of the Western Reserve: coal from Pennsylvania and West Virginia, iron ore from around Lake Superior, salt from Michigan, grain and corn from the Plains states. As a port on Lake Erie and the Ohio Canal, Cleveland was a natural hub for transportation networks. When the Cleveland, Columbus, and Cincinnati Railroad arrived in 1851, it created excellent opportunities for transport by both water and rail, and nobody would more brilliantly exploit these options than John D. Rockefeller. For all the thriving waterfront commerce, the job prospects were momentarily bleak. "No one wanted a boy, and very few showed any overwhelming anxiety to talk with me on the subject," said Rockefeller. When he exhausted his list, he simply started over from the top and visited several firms 2 or 3 times. Another boy might have been crestfallen, but Rockefeller was the sort of stubborn person who only grew more determined with rejection. Then, on the morning of September 26, 1855, he walked into the offices of Hewitt and Tuttle, commission merchants and produce shippers on Merwin Street. He was interviewed by Henry B. Tuttle, the junior partner, who needed help with the books and asked him to return after lunch. Ecstatic, Rockefeller walked with restraint from the office, but when he got downstairs and rounded the corner, he skipped down the street with pure joy. Even as an elderly man, he saw the moment as endowed with high drama. All my future seemed to hinge on that day, and I often trembled when I asked myself the question, what if I had not got the job? In a fever of anxiety, Rockefeller waited until the noonday meal was over, then returned it to the office, where he was interviewed by senior partner Isaac L. Hewitt. Owner of a good deal of Cleveland real estate and the founder of the Cleveland Iron Mining Company, Hewitt must have seemed a mighty capitalist indeed. After scrutinizing the boy's penmanship, he declared, "We'll give you a chance." They were evidently in urgent need of an assistant bookkeeper, since they told Rockefeller to hang up his coat and go straight to work without any mention of wages. In those days, it wasn't unusual for an adolescent to serve an unpaid apprenticeship. It was 3 months before John received his first humble retroactive pay. For the rest of his life, he would honor September 26th as Job Day and celebrate it with more genuine brio than his birthday. One is tempted to say that his real life began on that day, that he was born again in business as he would be in the Erie Street Baptist Mission Church. All the latent dynamism that had been dormant during his country youth would now quicken into robust, startling life in the business world. He was finally liberated from Big Bill, the endless flight from town to town, the whole crazy upside-down world of his boyhood. Poised on a high stool, bent over musty ledger books at Hewitt and Tuttle, the new clerk could gaze from the window and watch the busy wharves or canal barges drifting by on the Cuyahoga River a block away. Though his day began at dawn, in an office lit dimly by whale oil lamps, this mercantile world never struck him as arid or boring, but was delightful to me, all the method and system of the office. Work enchanted him, work liberated him, work supplied him with a new identity. My duties were vastly more interesting than those of an office boy in a large house today, he later said. The mature Rockefeller liked to dub himself just a man of figures, and he found nothing dry or soporific about the tall ledgers. Having helped Eliza keep the books, he enjoyed a head start. As I began my life as a bookkeeper, I learned to have great respect for figures and facts, no matter how small they were. I had a passion for detail, which afterward I was forced to strive to modify. Business historians and sociologists have stressed the centrality of accounting to capitalist enterprise. In The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, Max Weber identified rational bookkeeping as integral to capitalism's spirit and organization. For Joseph Schumpeter, capitalism turns the unit of money into a tool of rational cost-profit calculations, of which the towering monument is double-entry bookkeeping. It thus seems fitting that John D. Rockefeller, the archetypal capitalist, betrayed a special affinity for accounting and an almost mystic faith in numbers. For Rockefeller, ledgers were sacred books that guided decisions and saved one from fallible emotion. They gauged performance, exposed fraud, and ferreted out hidden inefficiencies. In an imprecise world, they rooted things in a solid empirical reality. As he chided slipshod rivals, many of the brightest kept their books in such a way that they did not actually know when they were making money on a certain operation and when they were losing. When Hewitt and Tuttle assigned Rockefeller to pay the bills, he went at this task with an undisguised zeal, a precocious virtuosity, and attended to it with more responsibility than the spending of my own funds. He closely reviewed the bills, confirming the validity of each item and carefully adding up the totals. He pounced on errors of even a few cents and reacted with scornful amazement when the boss next door handed his clerk a lengthy, unexamined plumbing bill and blithely said, "Please pay this bill." Rockefeller was appalled by such cavalier indifference, having just bought the same firm in an overcharge of several cents. One suspects that this stickler for detail taught Hewitt and Tuttle a thing or two about economy. I recall that there was one captain who was always putting in claims for damages to shipments, and I decided to investigate. I examined all the invoices, bills of lading, and other documents, and found this captain had presented entirely unwarranted claims. He never did it again. In all probability, the boy's orderly nature reflected a need to govern potentially unruly emotions, an exaggerated reaction to his disorderly father and helter-skelter childhood. Besides writing letters, keeping books, and paying bills, young Rockefeller also served as a one-man collection agency for Hewitt's rental properties. Though patient and polite, he displayed a bulldog tenacity that took people by surprise. Sitting outside in his buggy, pale and patient as an undertaker, he would wait until the debtor capitulated. He dunned people as if his life depended on it, an experience apparently laced with considerable anxiety. How many times I have dreamed now and then after recent years that I was trying to collect those bills, he marveled 50 years later. I would wake up exclaiming, "I can't collect so-and-so's account." One explanation for his anxiety is that his flight from his distressing family life was still tenuous, and failure at work would mean reverting to reliance on his father. Another explanation is that while he was persistent, he was also extremely slow. As at school, some people thought him a rather dim-witted dolt who would never rise in the world, and he had to prove himself to naysayers. However modest in operation, Hewitt and Tuttle was an excellent training ground for an aspiring young businessman, where it exposed Rockefeller to a broad commercial universe. Before the Civil War, most businesses still confined themselves to a single service or product. Hewitt and Tuttle, in contrast, traded a wide array of commodities on commission. Though it had started out dealing in foodstuffs, it had pioneered in importing iron ore from Lake Superior 3 years before Rockefeller was hired. The firm relied upon the railroad and the telegraph, the two technologies then revolutionizing the American economy. As Rockefeller remarked, "My eyes were open to the business of transportation. No small thing, given Standard Oil's subsequent controversial relations with the railroads. Even a simple consignment of Vermont marble to Cleveland required complex calculations of the relative costs of railroad, canal, and lake transportation. The cost of losses or damage had to be somehow fixed between these three different carriers, and it taxed all the ingenuity of a boy of 17 to work out this problem to the satisfaction of all concerned, including my employers." No business experience was ever wasted upon Rockefeller. On the last day of 1855, Hewitt handed Rockefeller $50 for 3 months of work, or slightly more than 50 cents a day. Effective immediately, Hewitt announced, the assistant bookkeeper would have his wages boosted sharply to $25 a month, or $300 per year. Oddly, Rockefeller felt guilty about the raise. "I felt like a criminal." Again, one has a hunch that he was jubilant, but feared, out of religious scruples, his own greed. Accumulating money was one thing Rockefeller knew, but outwardly coveting it was another. In many ways, John D. Rockefeller exemplified the enterprising young businessman of his era. Thrifty, punctual, industrious, he was a fervent adherent of the gospel of success. He could have been the hero of any of the 119 inspirational tracts soon to be penned by Horatio Alger Jr. Books that bore such sonorous titles as Strive and Succeed, Luck and Pluck, Brave and Bold, and Bound to Rise. This last title, in fact, echoed Rockefeller's ecstatic boast to an older businessman one day. "I am bound to be rich, bound to be rich, bound to be rich." He was said to have punctuated this refrain by several smart, emphatic whacks on his companion's knee. And John D. didn't become demonstrative about too many pallets. Though Rockefeller steadfastly denied these stories of his boyhood obsession with money, he related the following story of his time at Hewitt and Tuttle. "I was a young man when I got my first look at a banknote of any size. I was clerking at the time down on the flats here. One day my employer received a note from a downstate bank for $4,000. He showed it to me in the course of the day's business, and then put it in the safe. As soon as he was gone, I unlocked the safe, and taking out that note, stared at it with open eyes and mouth, and then replaced it and double-locked the safe. It seemed like an awfully large sum to me, an unheard-of amount. Many times during the day did I open that safe to gaze longingly at the note." In this story, one can almost feel the erotic charge that the banknote aroused in the boy, a way of casting a hypnotic trance over him. One is reminded of how Big Bill bundled his bills, stored them away, then enjoyed peeking at his hidden treasure. This lusting after money is the more striking in a phlegmatic young man who claimed never to struggle with disruptive impulses. "I never had a craving for tobacco or tea and coffee," he once stated flatly. "I never had a craving for anything." If motivated by greed more than he ever cared to admit, Rockefeller also derived a glandular pleasure from work and never found it cheerless drudgery. In fact, the business world entranced him as a fount of inexhaustible wonders. "It is by no means for money alone that these active-minded men labor. They are engaged in a fascinating occupation," he wrote in his memoirs, published in 1908 to 1909. "The zest of the work is maintained by something better than the mere accumulation of money." Because American culture encouraged, nay, glorified, acquisitive behavior, there was always the possibility that it might be taken to extremes and people would end up enslaved by their greed. As a result, children were taught to monitor and supervise their behavior. In his posthumously published autobiography, Benjamin Franklin describes how he drew up a little moral ledger that allowed him, at a glance, to track his virtues and vices every day. Many people in the mid-19th century kept such journals to enforce thrift and also objectify their moral performance. Adolescents kept diaries larded with pep talks, exhortations, inspirations, and warnings. Andrew Carnegie wrote hortatory memos to himself, while William C. Whitney kept a small notebook of little homilies. A contradictory impulse was at work. People were spurring themselves to excel, but also trying to curb their insatiable appetites in the new competitive economy. John D. Rockefeller took such internal monitoring to an advanced stage. Like a good Puritan, He scrutinized his daily activities and regulated his desires, hoping to banish spontaneity and unpredictability from his life. Whenever his ambition was about to devour him, his conscience urged restraint. Since he worked a long day at Hewitt and Tuttle, business threatened to become an overwhelming compulsion. Starting work each day at 6:30 a.m., he brought a box lunch to the office and often returned after dinner, staying late. One day he decided to throttle this obsession. I had this day covenanted with myself not to be seen in the office after 10 o'clock p.m. within 30 days, he wrote to himself. It is telling that the young man made such a pledge to himself, and equally revealing that he found it impossible to obey. No less than his business life, Rockefeller's private life was ruled by bookkeeping entries. Since he found numbers so clean and soothing in their simplicity, he applied the business principles of Hewitt and Tuttle to his own personal economy. When he started working in September 1855, he paid a dime for a small red book, anointed Ledger A, in which he minutely recorded his receipts and expenditures. Many of his young contemporaries kept such record books, but seldom with such exacting care. For the remainder of his life, Rockefeller treated Ledger A as his most sacred relic. Producing it before Bible classes more than 50 years later, he became almost tearful and trembled as he thumbed its pages. So potent were the emotions it evoked. At a Bible class at the Fifth Avenue Baptist Church in 1897, a deeply moved Rockefeller held the book aloft and intoned, "I haven't seen this book for 25 years. You couldn't get it away from me for all the modern ledgers in New York and what they all would bring in." The book rested in a safety deposit vault, like some priceless heirloom. As Ledger A confirms, Rockefeller was now self-supporting and entirely free of his father, spending half his income for his lodging with Mrs. Wooden and for a washerwoman. He took pride in memories of his threadbare adolescence. "I could not secure the most fashionable cut of clothing. I remember I bought mine then from a cheap clothier. He sold me clothing cheap such as I could pay for, and it was a great deal better than buying clothes I could not pay for." He was long puzzled by one lapse from strict economy. He bought a pair of fur gloves for $2.50 to replace his customary woolen mittens, and at age 90 was still plucking his tongue over this shocking extravagance. "No, I can't say to this day what caused me to waste that $2.50 on regular gloves." Another expense, pregnant with interest for the mature Rockefeller, was his purchase of an illuminant called Campine for 88 cents per gallon. Thanks to massive economies of scale, Standard Oil eventually sold a superior illuminant, kerosene, for 5 cents a gallon, something Rockefeller was wont to recall when people later accused him of gouging the populace. In one critical respect, Rockefeller didn't exaggerate the value of Ledger A, for it spoke authoritatively to the question of whether he was a rapacious man who later misused charity to cleanse a tainted fortune. Here, Ledger A speaks with a firm and unequivocal voice. Rockefeller was fantastically charitable from boyhood. During his first year on the job, the young clerk donated about 6% of his wages to charity, some weeks much more. "I have my earliest ledger, and when I was only making $1 a day, I was giving 5, 10, or 25 cents to all these objects," he observed. He gave to the 5 Points Mission in the notorious Lower Manhattan slum, as well as to a poor man in church and a poor woman in church. By 1859, when he was 20, his charitable giving surpassed the 10% mark. Despite a pronounced tilt toward Baptist causes, he gave early hints of an ecumenical bent, contributing money to a black man in Cincinnati in 1859 so he could buy his wife out of slavery. The next year, he gave to a black church, a Methodist church, and a Catholic orphanage. The clerk's philanthropic gifts were as salient as his business talents. It testifies to Rockefeller's deeply paradoxical nature that he was smitten by a $4,000 banknote, but equally entranced by an 1855 book entitled Extracts from the Diary and Correspondence of the late Amos Lawrence. A wealthy New England textile manufacturer, Lawrence gave away more than $100,000 in a planned, thoughtful fashion. "I remember how fascinated I was with his letters," said Rockefeller, who might have gotten from Lawrence his later habit of handing out freshly minted money to people. "Crisp bills. I could see and hear them. I made up my mind that if I could manage it, someday I would give away crisp bills, too." However rare and admirable such thoughts are in a teenage boy, we must note that it was again a case of money exerting a magical effect upon his mind. He saw that money could bring majesty in the moral as well as secular sphere, which excited him more than fancy estates or clothes. As if he knew he would someday be rich and had to prepare for the appointed hour, the assistant bookkeeper became a perceptive observer of the businessmen around the port and noted their avoidance of ostentation. For instance, he tremendously admired a shipping merchant named L.R. Morris, and was struck by the way he walked, the way he looked, quite unaffected by his great riches. I saw other wealthy men, and I was glad to see that they went about their business without any display of power or money. Later I saw some who wore rich jewels and luxurious clothes. It seemed unfortunate that they were led into such lavish style. If Rockefeller kept to a Quakerish sobriety of dress and later resisted the vulgar display of the Vanderbilts and other Gilded Age moguls with their elaborate mansions and yachts, it had something to do with his Baptist beliefs, but also with the plain, understated style of the wealthy Cleveland businessmen he studied so attentively at a formative stage of his life. Like innumerable young people before him, Rockefeller turned to the church for all-encompassing answers to intractable family problems. He possessed a sense of calling in both religion and business, with Christianity and capitalism forming the twin pillars of his life. While Charles Darwin's Origin of Species began to chip away at many people's faith after it was published in 1859, Rockefeller's religion remained of the simple, undeviating sort. When challenges to orthodoxy arose in later decades, he stuck by the spiritual certainties of his boyhood. Because of his father's often unscrupulous behavior, the young clerk was ripe for fiery denunciations of sin and the talk of personal salvation and moral reformation that were then staples of Baptist discourse. From the beginning, his Baptist faith served as a powerful instrument to control forbidden feelings and check his father's unruly nature within him. After the constant flux of his childhood, he yearned to be rooted in a church that would act as his substitute family, but without the shameful aspects of his real one. While John and William boarded with Mrs. Wooden and her daughter Martha, the four of them began to attend a poor, struggling church nearby called the Erie Street Baptist Mission Church. Organized 3 years earlier by the well-heeled First Baptist Church, the Mission Church was a spare white building with a belfry and tall, narrow windows, standing in a flat, treeless space. Several religious revivals had rolled through Cleveland in the 1850s, and the Erie Street Baptist Mission Church was created in the aftermath of a revival meeting that lasted 150 consecutive nights. The church gave Rockefeller the community of friends he craved and the respect and affection he needed. Having studied in Deacon Alexander Skedd's Bible class, Rockefeller was recruited to the church by Skedd, a florist by trade, a poetical Scot who loved to spout psalms and prophecies and seemed to know the whole Bible by heart. Born in Scotland in 1780, Skedd arrived in America in 1831 and moved to Cleveland 4 years later. During services, he would lift his hands in supplication to God, his face shining with fervor. This pious elderly man served as a mentor to Rockefeller, who sought him out to report the good news that he got his job at Hewitt & Tuttle, an encounter that produced an unexpected snub that Rockefeller never forgot. Before I went away, he remarked that he liked me pretty well, but that he had always liked my brother William better. I could never think why he said that. I did not hold it against him, but it puzzled me. In the fall of 1854, after making a personal confession of faith, John was immersed in the baptismal basin by Deacon Skedd and became a full-fledged church member. Never a snob, Rockefeller was proud of being brought up in a mission church. Notwithstanding his worldly ambition, he didn't seek social shortcuts to success by joining a prosperous congregation or a high church denomination. As a loner and outsider, he was drawn by the warm fellowship of the faithful and liked the egalitarian atmosphere of the Erie Street Church, which gave him the opportunity to associate, as he put it, with people in the most humble of circumstances. A central tenet of baptism is the autonomy of individual congregations, and the mission churches, which weren't dominated by established families, were the most democratic of all. The Erie Street Church was populated by salesmen, shop assistants, railroad conductors, factory workers, clerks, artisans, and others of extremely modest means. Even in its late fancier incarnation as the Euclid Avenue Baptist Church, the membership remained more plebeian than patrician. In his later years, Rockefeller declared with heartfelt warmth, "How grateful I am that these associations were given to me in my early boyhood, that I was contented and happy with the work in the church, with the work in the Sunday school, with the work with good people. That was my environment, and I thank God for it." Instead of merely attending services, Rockefeller performed numberless tasks in the church. While still in his teens, he became a Sunday school teacher, a trustee, and an unpaid clerk who kept the board minutes in his own hand. Free of false pride, he delighted even in menial chores, and one woman in the congregation left this vivid vignette of his ubiquitous presence. In those years, Rockefeller might have been found there any Sunday, sweeping out the halls, building a fire, lighting the lamps, cleaning the walks, ushering the people to their seats, studying the Bible, praying, singing, performing all the duties of an unselfish and thoroughgoing church member. He was nothing but a clerk and had little money, and yet he gave something to every organization in the little old church. He was always very precise about it. If he said that he would give 15 cents, not a living soul could move him to give a penny more or a penny less. He studied his Bible regularly and diligently, and he knew what was in it. One notes his proprietary feeling about the church, how lovingly he tended it. In some respects, he acted as a volunteer janitor, sweeping the austere chapel, washing the windows, replenishing the candles in wall sconces, or stoking the corner base burner with wood. On Sundays, he rang the bell to summon people to prayer and kindled the fire, and then, to economize, snuffed out all the candles save one as people filed from the service. Save when you can and not when you have to, he instructed others, and urged them to wear their good Sunday clothing to work as a sign of their Christian pride. Besides Friday evening prayer meetings, he went to services twice on Sunday and was always a conspicuous figure in a straight-backed pew, kneeling and leading the congregation in prayer. He prized the special intensity of feeling that Baptists brought to their faith, which provided an emotional release lacking elsewhere in his life. With a right baritone voice refined by singing lessons at church, he boomed out hymns with deep joy. His favorite, "I've Found a Friend," portrayed Jesus in tenderly familiar terms. "I've found a friend, oh, such a friend. He bled, he died to save me." In a world full of snares to entrap the unsuspecting pilgrim, Rockefeller tried hard to insulate himself from all temptation. As he later saw it, a boy must ever be careful to avoid the temptations which beset him, to select carefully his associates and give attention as well to his spiritual and mental and material interests. Since evangelicals abstained from dancing, cards, and theater, Rockefeller restricted his private life to church socials and picnics, where he could play blind man's buff and engage in other innocent pastimes. As a model Baptist, he was sought after by the young ladies. "The girls all liked John immensely," said one congregant. "Some of them came dangerously near to being in love with him. He was not especially attractive in his person, and his clothes were strenuously plain and well worn. He was thought much of by these spiritual-minded young women because of his goodness, his religious fervor, his earnestness and willingness in the church, and his apparent sincerity and honesty of purpose." Over lemonade and cake at church socials, Rockefeller developed a close attachment to a pretty young woman named Emma Saunders, who chafed that John wouldn't broaden his social activities and insisted upon confining their dating to the church. For Rockefeller, the church was more than a set of theological positions. It was a fellowship of virtuous, like-minded people, and he always hesitated to stray too far from its protective embrace. Though generally reserved, Rockefeller developed convivial habits in church that lingered for life, and it bothered him when people marched off right after the Sunday service. "There ought to be something that makes the church home-like," he insisted. "Friends should be glad to see each other and to greet strangers." Even in later years, when huge swarms of people congregated at the church door to glimpse the world's richest man, he would still clasp people's hands and bask in the glow of familial warmth. The handshake acquired symbolic meaning for him, for it was the friendly hand extended to the man who doesn't know that he is wanted that brings many a one into the church. This early feeling about handshaking has stayed with me. All my life I have enjoyed this thing that says, "I am your friend." Just as Rockefeller was sensitive to condescending treatment in the business world, he couldn't stand it in the religious realm either. Since mission churches weren't self-financing, Rockefeller and other trustees had to submit to patronizing advice from the mother church. This strengthened our resolve to show them that we could paddle our own canoe. While Rockefeller's religious faith ran strong, he was most involved in the temporal affairs of the church, which he thought should be run like a tidy business. He soon had a chance to defend the church's solvency when it fell behind on interest payments on a $2,000 mortgage held by a deacon. One Sunday, the pastor announced from the pulpit that this creditor threatened to foreclose on the church, and that they had to raise $2,000 very fast to survive. As the stunned congregation filed out, they found Rockefeller stationed at the door, buttonholing people and asking them to pledge specific amounts. I pleaded, urged, and almost threatened. But Rockefeller refused. He insisted that the church As each one promised, I put his name and the amount down in my little book and continued to solicit from every possible subscriber. Perhaps nothing in his early life so foreshadowed his unswerving pursuit of business goals. The plan absorbed me, he admitted. I contributed what I could, and my first ambition to earn money was aroused by this and similar undertakings in which I was constantly engaged. In a matter of months, he had raised $2,000 and saved the church. By age 20, he had emerged as the second most important member of the congregation, surpassed only by the preacher. With a mostly Spartan country education and scant exposure to big city culture, John D. Rockefeller's mind was largely furnished with precepts and phrases from his Baptist fundamentalist church. Throughout his life, he extracted from Christianity practical lessons for living and emphasized the utility of religion as a guide in mundane affairs. Over time, the American public would wonder how he squared his predatory bent with his religion. Yet much that was preached in the church of his youth, at least as Rockefeller saw it, encouraged his money-making predilections. Far from placing obstacles in his path, the religion he encountered seemed to applaud him in his course, and he very much embodied the sometimes uneasy symbiosis between church and business that defined the emerging ethos of the post-Civil War American economy. Rockefeller never wavered in his belief that his career was divinely favored, and asserted bluntly, "God gave me my money." During the decades that he taught Sunday school classes, he found plenty of scriptural evidence to buttress this claim. Of course, his critics would cite many contrary quotations warning of the pernicious influence of wealth. When Benjamin Franklin was a boy, his father had pounded into his head the proverb, "Seest thou a man diligent in his business, he shall stand before kings." And Rockefeller often presented this text to his class. Martin Luther had exhorted his congregation, "Even though your work seems very trivial and contemptible, make sure you regard it as great and precious, not on account of your worthiness, but because it has its place within that jewel and holy treasure, the word and commandment of God." Many eminent 19th century theologians took the Calvinist view that wealth was a sign of God's grace, and poverty a telltale sign of heavenly disfavor. Henry Ward Beecher, calling poverty the fault of the poor, proclaimed in a sermon that generally the proposition is true, that where you find the most religion, you find the most worldly prosperity. As to why God had singled out John D. Rockefeller for such spectacular bounty, Rockefeller always adverted to his own adherence to the doctrine of stewardship, the notion of the wealthy man as a mere instrument of God, a temporary trustee of his money who devoted it to good causes. "It has seemed as if I was favored and got increase because the Lord knew I was going to turn around and give it back." Rockefeller said this in his late 70s. One wonders whether the equation between money-making and money-giving only entered his mind later. Yet even as a teenager, he took palpable pleasure in distributing money for charitable purposes, and he insisted that from an early date he discerned the intimate spiritual link between earning and dispensing money. "I remember clearly when the financial plan, if I may call it so, of my life was formed. It was out in Ohio under the ministration of a dear old minister who preached, 'Get money, get it honestly, and then give it wisely.' I wrote that down in a little book." This echoed John Wesley's dictum, "If those who gain all they can and save all they can will likewise give all they can, then the more they will grow in grace." Rockefeller operated by such spiritual double-entry bookkeeping, with his charity serving in time as incontestable proof of his fortune's purity. It might well be that his early commitment to charity gave him some inner license needed to pursue wealth with unparalleled, and at times unprincipled, vigor. As Max Weber observed, ascetic Christianity was a matchless breeding ground for would-be businessmen. The practice of tithing, for instance, instilled habits of thrift, self-denial, and careful budgeting that were invaluable assets for any aspiring capitalist. John D. Rockefeller was the Protestant work ethic in its purest form, leading a life so consistent with Weber's classic essay that it reads like his spiritual biography. It might be useful to note some of Weber's aperçus that apply with a special force to Rockefeller. Weber argued that the Puritans had produced a religion that validated worldly activity, with the making of money by acquisition as the ultimate purpose of life. They approached business in a rational, methodical manner, banishing magic from the marketplace and reducing everything to method. Because prosperity was a sign of future salvation, the elect worked with special diligence to reassure themselves of God's favor. Even those who amassed great wealth continued to labor, since they worked ostensibly for God's glory, not for their own aggrandizement. The church didn't want to be in the position of promoting greed, so it circumvented this problem by legitimating the pursuit of money if channeled into a calling, that is, the steady dedication to a productive task. Once a person discovered his calling, he was supposed to apply himself with all-consuming devotion, the money thus acquired being deemed a sign of God's blessing. One byproduct of the emphasis on a calling was that Puritans relegated activities outside the religious and economic sphere to a lesser order of importance. The believer wasn't supposed to search for pleasure beyond the sheltered confines of family, church, and business. The gravest sins were wasting time, indulging in idle chatter, and wallowing in luxurious diversions. Bent on making money, the good Puritan had to restrain his impulses instead of gratifying them. As Weber remarked, unlimited greed for gain is not in the least identical with capitalism, and is still less in spirit. Capitalism may even be identical with the restraint, or at least a rational tempering, of this irrational impulse. That is, the man who would be rich must be thrifty. People had to regulate their lives, Weber argued, so that self-abnegation could bring forth plenty. A fateful contradiction lay at the heart of this Puritan culture, for the virtues of godly people made them rich, and these riches in turn threatened to undermine that godliness. As Cotton Mather declared of the Plymouth colony in the 1690s, religion begot prosperity, and the daughters devoured the mother. This contradiction posed a central dilemma for John D. Rockefeller and his descendants, who would struggle tirelessly against the baneful effects of wealth. Of the four principal groups of ascetic Protestants analyzed by Weber, we should note the Baptists alone rejected predestination, and therefore couldn't construe wealth as an infallible sign of God's favor. On the other hand, as Weber pointed out, certain Baptist tenets prepared its adherents to prosper in the marketplace. Abhorring religious idolatry, demoting sacraments as a means to salvation, baptism fostered a rational outlook that was well suited to advancement in capitalist society. Rockefeller was convinced that he had a God-given talent for making money, was obligated to develop it, and was liberally rewarded by God, all compatible with Baptist doctrine. For this reason, he found religion far more of a spur than a hindrance to his ambitions. Where others saw him as an anomaly in a denomination that always welcomed working people and harbored a faint distrust of the rich, he never saw any such contradiction. Before leaving Rockefeller's early Baptist indoctrination, we should note that the economic climate of his adolescence must have deepened his religious convictions. In 1857, while he was still at Hewitt and Tuttle, America fell into an economic slump. The proximate cause was the end of the Crimean War in 1856, which dealt a blow to American farmers who had profited from the war. On a more profound level, the crisis capped a decade of frantic speculation in railroad securities and land, stoked by heavy borrowing. As 5,000 businesses failed and hundreds of thousands of workers were idle, the exuberant boosterism of the 1850s was suddenly and dramatically quelled. As happened in the Great Depression of the 1930s, people were shocked that an effervescent economy could stall so woefully. As one contemporary observer put it, it seems indeed strange that in the very midst of apparent health and strength, the whole country should suddenly come to a dead stop and be unable to move forward, and that we should suddenly wake up from our dreams of wealth and happiness and find ourselves poor and bankrupt. A wave of hysterical breast-beating ensued, with President James Buchanan insisting that the crisis came solely from our extravagant and vicious system of paper currency and bank credits, exciting the people to wild speculations and gambling in stocks. Rather than blaming the business cycle, many evangelical Christians interpreted the downturn as divine punishment for a society grown lax, worldly, and dissolute. One Boston reformer described redeeming features in the slump, hoping it would teach good and much-needed lessons, and will reduce all things here to a more sober, sound, and healthy condition. The mood of national self-flagellation prompted a religious upsurge known as the Businessmen's Revival. In 1857, businessmen gathered in many cities for lunchtime prayer meetings, where they publicly swore off drink and other indulgences. During this massive outpouring of repentance, evangelical churches recruited tens of thousands of new members. The shift from euphoria to depression in the business sphere, mirrored by a shift from sin to salvation in the religious sphere, probably strengthened Rockefeller's innate conservatism as a fledgling businessman, while bolstering his already deep-seated Baptist inclinations. As he said, "What a school, the school of adversity and stress, to train a boy in." Whatever Whatever the general misery caused by the 1857 panic, William Avery Rockefeller's Medical Roadshow thrived that year, and he briefly managed to support and juggle 2 marriages. In the spring of 1856, Bill had surfaced again in Cleveland, rooming with John and William at Mrs. Wooden's, while scouting out a permanent home for his family. He was residing intermittently with Margaret Allen's family in Ontario, posing as Dr. William Livingston, who now had to make some final disposition before he deserted his first wife and children for good. When he found a roomy brick house for rent at 35 Cedar Street, equipped with such luxuries as indoor toilet and bathroom, he brought Eliza and the children in from Parma. John and William moved out of Mrs. Wooden's place and were reunited with their family. At this point, Bill decided that John would contribute to family upkeep and pay him the same rent he had given to Mrs. Wooden. In 1857, Bill decided to build for his family a substantial brick house on Cheshire Street in downtown Cleveland, a farewell gift that would enable him to abscond with a clear conscience. In 1857, my father told me to build a house, said John D., giving the story a positive gloss. It was a lesson in self-reliance. He handed me the money, told me the sort of house he wanted, and left all the details of the business to me. I drew plans, cut the material, found a builder, and built the house. Did Bill regard this as some final test? A crash course in business for John before he abandoned his family to the tender mercies of chance? As he warned his son, I shall be away and must rely on your judgment. Or perhaps Bill just wanted to be spared the inconvenience of doing it himself. Rockefeller was justifiably proud of his feat of superintending this house, a bravura performance for a boy of 18 with an already demanding schedule at Hewitt and Tuttle. As if he had been doing nothing but construction work all his life, he solicited estimates from 8 contractors and selected the lowest bidder. He reviewed the plans, negotiated the contracts, and settled the bills with implicit confidence in his judgment. In fact, so closely did he supervise the contractors, so zealously did he outbargain them, that they lost money on the project. If Bill was testing his son's ability, he passed with flying colors. By one account, a dispute arose as to whether John would pay rent at the new house. He presumably felt that having built the structure, he had earned the right to occupy it free of rent. But Devil Bill laid down his own arbitrary rules and overrode Eliza's protests. You bought your time, didn't you? He told John. What you're getting now is your own, ain't it? Well, you have to pay me board. Once again, one marvels at Bill's bare-faced cheek, no less than his son's fortitude in the face of repeated provocations. Now that the Rockefellers were reconstituted in Cleveland, John was deputized